Our first story comes from someone who learned that some people have very selective memories when it comes to important dates. My partner forgot my birthday, but threw a party for their best friend the same week. I'm 24, and my partner Clara is 26. We've been together for almost 2 years, and I genuinely thought we had a solid relationship, built on mutual respect and consideration for each other. My birthday was last Tuesday, and I'd been dropping subtle hints for weeks. Nothing crazy, just mentioning how excited I was about turning 24, talking about maybe doing something nice together, the usual stuff you do when you're hoping someone will remember an important day. Tuesday morning came and went without so much as a happy birthday text from Clara. She left for work early, came home late, and acted like it was just another ordinary day. I kept waiting for her to surprise me, thinking maybe she was planning something special for later in the week. I gave her the benefit of the doubt because people get busy, and maybe she just wanted to do something on the weekend instead. But then Friday rolled around, and Clara started buzzing around our apartment like she was preparing for the event of the century. She was on the phone coordinating food orders, decorating our living room with balloons and streamers, and generally putting more effort into party planning than I'd seen from her in months. When I asked what was going on, she told me it was her best friend, Taylor's birthday party. Taylor's birthday party. In our apartment, with all the decorations and planning and excitement that my birthday hadn't received 3 days earlier. I watched Clara spend hours preparing this elaborate celebration, complete with a custom cake she'd ordered from some fancy bakery across town, a playlist she'd been working on for days, and party favours she'd bought specifically for the occasion. She invited about 15 people, made sure everyone knew to bring gifts, and even coordinated with Taylor's other friends to ensure nothing was forgotten. The party was incredible. Clara was the perfect host, making sure everyone had drinks, introducing people who hadn't met, taking photos to capture every moment. She gave a heartfelt speech about how much Taylor meant to her, and how grateful she was to have such an amazing friend in her life. Taylor was glowing, clearly touched by the efforts Clara had put into making her day special. I stood in the corner of my own living room, watching my partner celebrate someone else with the kind of enthusiasm I'd been hoping for on my own birthday. When Taylor opened her gifts, Clara had gotten her this beautiful necklace that she'd clearly put thought into choosing. It was personal, meaningful, exactly the kind of present that shows you really know someone. After the party ended and we were cleaning up, I finally brought up my birthday. I wasn't trying to start a fight, just wanted to understand how she could forget something so important to me while remembering every detail of Taylor's celebration. Clara looked genuinely confused for a moment, then her face changed as she realised what had happened. She apologised immediately, saying she'd been so stressed with work and planning Taylor's party that my birthday had completely slipped her mind. She promised to make it up to me, suggested we could do something special the following weekend. But the damage was already done. It wasn't about the party or the gifts or even the recognition. It was about feeling like I mattered enough to be remembered. The worst part was seeing how effortlessly she'd managed to plan and execute this perfect celebration for Taylor, while my birthday didn't even register as a blip on her radar. It made me question whether I was actually important to her or just convenient to have around. Clara did try to make it up to me the next weekend. She took me to dinner and gave me a gift card to a store I liked, but it felt obligatory rather than genuine, like she was checking off a box rather than celebrating someone she cared about. We've talked about it since then, and she insists it was just an honest mistake, that she loves me and would never intentionally hurt me like that. But I can't shake the feeling that you don't forget the birthday of someone who really matters to you, especially not when you're simultaneously planning an elaborate celebration for someone else. It's been a few weeks now, and things between us feel different. I find myself wondering if this is a sign of how she really prioritizes our relationship. That story ends right there. The selective memory some people have is absolutely incredible. You can plan a Pinterest-worthy celebration for a friend while your partner's birthday becomes invisible. It's not about the party itself, It's about feeling like an afterthought in your own relationship. That kind of oversight says more about priorities than any apology ever could. Speaking of workplace dynamics that make you question humanity, this next story involves someone who learned that some people have zero shame when it comes to stealing credit. My co-worker took credit for a joke I made in a meeting. I work at a mid-sized marketing agency, and we have these weekly team meetings where everyone shares updates and ideas for current projects. It's usually pretty casual, and our boss encourages us to keep things light and engaging since we're dealing with creative work. Last Thursday, we were discussing this campaign for a local restaurant chain, and the client had been particularly difficult about their messaging. They kept changing their minds about the tone, going back and forth between wanting something sophisticated and something more casual and fun. Our team had been struggling to nail down exactly what they wanted. During the meeting, I made what I thought was a pretty clever observation. I said, "Working with this client is like trying to help someone choose a wedding dress. When they can't decide if they want a beach wedding or a black tie affair, we keep showing them gorgeous options, but they're shopping for two completely different events." Everyone laughed, including our boss, who said it was a perfect analogy for the situation. It felt good to contribute something that resonated with the team and helped frame the challenge we were facing. The joke also helped lighten the mood, since everyone had been feeling frustrated with how indecisive the client had been. But then, not even 5 minutes later, my co-worker Theo started building on the conversation. He said, like I was just thinking, working with this client is like trying to help someone choose a wedding dress. When they can't decide if they want a beach wedding or a black tie affair, we keep showing them gorgeous options, but they're shopping for two completely different events. He repeated my joke word for word, as if it had just occurred to him. Our boss nodded approvingly and said, "That's exactly right, Theo. Great way to put it." Several other co-workers chimed in, agreeing with Theo's insight, and suddenly my observation had become his brilliant analogy. I sat there stunned, not sure if I should say something or just let it slide. Part of me wondered if maybe Theo genuinely thought he'd come up with it himself. Like maybe he'd heard what I said and somehow internalized it as his own thought. But the timing was so blatant, and he'd repeated it so exactly that it was clearly intentional. The meeting continued, and Theo basked in the positive feedback for his clever comparison. Our boss even mentioned it again at the end of the meeting, praising Theo for his creative thinking and ability to reframe complex client relationships in relatable terms. After the meeting ended, I considered pulling Theo aside to address what had happened, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up without sounding petty or accusatory. It was just a joke after all, not some groundbreaking idea or major contribution. But it still felt wrong to have my words attributed to someone else, especially when that person was sitting right there when I said them. Over the next few days, I noticed our boss seemed to view Theo differently. He started asking for Theo's input more often and referencing that great analogy in conversations with other team members. It was like that one moment of perceived insight had elevated Theo's status in our boss's eyes, and he was now seen as someone with particularly sharp creative instincts. The whole situation made me more aware of office dynamics I'd never really paid attention to before. I started noticing how often people would slightly rephrase someone else's idea and present it as their own contribution. It happened in almost every meeting, these small moments where credit got reassigned to whoever spoke most confidently or had the boss's ear. I never did confront Theo about it directly, but I made sure to be more assertive about claiming my ideas in subsequent meetings. When I had something to contribute, I'd make sure to frame it clearly as my own thought and follow up with additional details so it couldn't be easily repeated by someone else. The experience taught me that even in collaborative environments, you have to protect your contributions if you want to get credit for them. Some people will absolutely take advantage of your ideas if you don't make it clear they belong to you. That story is over. The workplace joke thief strikes again. It takes a special kind of person to hear someone's words, wait exactly 5 minutes, then repeat them verbatim like they just had an epiphany. The second-hand embarrassment from watching someone steal credit so blatantly is almost as bad as being the person who got robbed. Theo really thought nobody would notice that lightning-fast creative process. Our next story takes us into wedding territory, where family dynamics can turn a celebration into a battlefield faster than you can say, "I do." My cousin showed up in a wedding dress to my ceremony. Planning a wedding is stressful enough without having to worry about your own family members trying to upstage you, but apparently that was too much to ask for. My cousin Selene and I have always had a complicated relationship. She's 3 years older than me, and growing up she had this way of making everything about herself, but I thought we'd moved past that dynamic as adults. When I got engaged 8 months ago, Selena seemed genuinely happy for me. She offered to help with planning, asked about dress shopping, and generally acted like the supportive cousin I'd always hoped she could be. I was cautiously optimistic that maybe our relationship had matured, and she'd be able to celebrate my big day without any drama. I sent her the invitation with a note, saying how much it would mean to me to have her there. The dress code was clearly stated as cocktail attire, with a note requesting that guests avoid wearing white, or anything that might be mistaken for bridal wear. I thought this was pretty standard wedding etiquette, but I included it just to be extra clear about expectations. The morning of my wedding, I was getting ready with my bridesmaids when my phone started buzzing with texts from various family members. My aunt sent a message asking if I knew what Selene was planning to wear. My grandmother called to ask if there was some kind of miscommunication about the dress code. I had no idea what they were talking about, but I was too busy with hair and makeup to investigate. The ceremony was beautiful. Everything went exactly as planned until the moment guests started taking their seats. I was hidden away in the bridal suite, but my maid of honor came rushing in with a look of panic on her face. She told me there was a situation with Selena that I needed to know about before walking down the aisle. Apparently, Selene had arrived wearing a full-length white gown with lace detailing, a train, and even a small veil tucked into her hair. It wasn't identical to my dress, but it was unmistakably bridal. Guests were whispering and staring, unsure if there was some kind of mistake or if this was intentional. My first instinct was to have someone ask her to leave or change clothes, but there wasn't time without delaying the entire ceremony. My photographer had already started capturing pre-ceremony moments. The musicians were in position and guests were seated. I made the decision to proceed as planned and deal with Selena later. Walking down the aisle, I could feel the tension in the room. Instead of focusing on my soon-to-be husband waiting at the altar, I was acutely aware of every guest's eyes darting between me and Selene. Some people looked confused, others appeared mortified on my behalf. The whole atmosphere felt charged with awkwardness instead of joy. During the reception, multiple guests approached me to ask about Selena's outfit. Some thought it was a bold fashion choice. Others assumed there was some family tradition I hadn't explained. A few people asked if she was making some kind of statement about my marriage, or if there was drama I should know about. When I finally confronted Selena about her choice, she acted completely innocent. She claimed it was just a white dress, and that she hadn't realised it would be inappropriate. She said she'd bought it specifically for my wedding because she wanted to look elegant and celebrate such an important family occasion. But this wasn't just any white dress. It had clearly been designed as wedding attire, complete with all the traditional elements that signify bridal wear. There was no way someone could accidentally assemble that outfit without knowing exactly what message it would send. The worst part was how she maintained her innocence throughout the entire conversation. She acted hurt that I would accuse her of trying to upstage me, claimed she would never intentionally do anything to detract from my special day, and suggested that maybe I was being overly sensitive about something that was really no big deal. Looking back at my wedding photos, there's this underlying tension visible in so many shots. You can see guests' confused expressions, The way people are positioned to avoid being photographed with Selene, the general atmosphere of discomfort that permeated what should have been a joyful celebration. My husband was incredibly supportive throughout the whole situation, but I could tell he was frustrated on my behalf. His family kept asking him privately what was going on with my cousin, putting him in the awkward position of having to explain behaviour he didn't understand either. Celine never apologised or acknowledged that her outfit choice was inappropriate. She continues to act like the whole thing was blown out of proportion and that everyone overreacted to what she insists was just an innocent fashion decision. The experience taught me that some people will always find ways to centre themselves, even during moments that are supposed to belong to someone else. It's been 6 months since the wedding, and I still feel frustrated when I think about how her actions affected what should have been the happiest day of my life. That story ends there. The just a white dress defence while wearing what amounts to a full bridal ensemble is peak gaslighting behaviour. Showing up to someone's wedding in white lace with a train and veil isn't a fashion accident, it's a calculated choice to steal attention. Some people really can't stand letting others have their moment in the spotlight. Our next story comes from someone who learned that some friends don't understand the concept of personal space or prior planning. My friend invited their new partner on our road trip without asking. I've been planning this road trip with my college friend Elias for literally 6 months. We mapped out the entire route from Portland to San Francisco, booked hotels along the way, and even created a shared playlist for the drive. This was supposed to be our chance to catch up properly, since we haven't spent quality time together since graduation 2 years ago. Elias has been dating someone new for about 3 weeks. Her name is Carmen, and from what I could tell through social media and the few times he'd mentioned her, things seemed pretty casual between them. I was happy he was seeing someone, but I didn't think much beyond that since our trip had been planned long before she was in the picture. 2 days before we were supposed to leave, Elias texted me, asking if I minded if Carmen joined us. Not asking if she could come along, but asking if I minded, as if it was already decided and he was just checking to make sure I wouldn't be weird about it. I was caught completely off guard because we'd never discussed bringing anyone else. And honestly, the whole point was for us to have uninterrupted time to reconnect. I tried to explain that I'd been looking forward to just the two of us hanging out, but Elias said Carmen was really excited about the trip, and he'd already mentioned it to her. He made it sound like I'd be ruining her expectations if I said no, even though I'd never agreed to include her in the first place. The morning we left, Carmen showed up with enough luggage for a month-long European vacation. Our carefully planned packing situation suddenly became a game of Tetris, trying to fit 3 people's belongings into a car designed for 2 travellers and their reasonable amount of stuff. I ended up having to leave some of my things behind because there simply wasn't room for everything. The dynamic in the car was exactly what I'd been worried about. Instead of catching up with Elias about our lives, careers, and all the things that had happened since we'd last spent real time together, I found myself listening to Carmen share stories about people I didn't know and experiences I hadn't been part of. Every conversation somehow circled back to her, and Elias seemed completely absorbed in making sure she was entertained. When we stopped for lunch, Carmen announced she was vegetarian and couldn't eat at the diner we'd specifically chosen because Elias and I had been talking about their famous burgers for months. We ended up at some overpriced salad place where she spent 20 minutes explaining her dietary restrictions to the confused server. Our hotel reservations were for double occupancy, which meant I got stuck with a rollaway bed in rooms that barely had space for the existing furniture. Carmen complained about the accommodations being smaller than she'd expected, apparently not realising that the trip hadn't been planned with her comfort in mind. The worst part was how Elias acted like this was all completely normal. He never acknowledged that bringing Carmen had fundamentally changed the entire purpose and dynamic of our trip. When I tried to bring up the fact that we hadn't gotten any time to actually talk, he said we were hanging out right now and didn't understand what I was complaining about. By the third day, I felt like a third wheel on my own vacation. Every activity became about what Carmen wanted to do or where she wanted to stop. The playlist we'd spent weeks curating got replaced with her music preferences. Even our inside jokes and shared memories felt awkward to reference because she wasn't part of them and would ask for explanations that killed the natural flow of conversation. Carmen seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she was intruding on something that hadn't been intended for her. She posted photos of the trip on Instagram with captions about spontaneous adventures with new friends, as if the whole thing had been a casual group outing rather than a carefully planned reunion between old friends. When we finally made it to San Francisco, I was exhausted and frustrated rather than recharged and reconnected. The trip I'd been looking forward to for months had become an exercise in watching my friend prioritize someone he'd known for 3 weeks over plans we made together half a year earlier. On the drive home, I tried one more time to talk to Elias about how the trip had played out differently than we'd originally discussed. He said he thought I'd had fun and didn't understand why I was being negative about including Carmen. He made it sound like I was being selfish for wanting to spend time with just him, as if expecting our planned trip to go according to plan was unreasonable. That story ends right there. Nothing says I value our friendship, quite like turning your planned one-on-one trip into an impromptu double date with someone you've known for 3 weeks. The complete lack of awareness about changing fundamental plans without discussion is staggering. Some people really think friendship means you should be grateful to be included in whatever they decide to do. Moving on to workplace dynamics that'll make you question everything about professional courtesy. My manager announced my promotion but gave it to someone else. I've been working at this marketing firm for 2.5 years, consistently exceeding my targets and taking on additional responsibilities whenever asked. 6 months ago, a senior position opened up in my department, and I applied immediately. It felt like the natural next step in my career, and my supervisor had been encouraging me to pursue advancement opportunities. The interview process was extensive, but went really well. I prepared thoroughly, presented case studies of successful campaigns I'd managed, and felt confident about my qualifications for the role. My manager, Jonah, seemed impressed during our discussion and mentioned that I'd shown real leadership potential over the past few years. 3 weeks after my final interview, Jonah called an all-hands team meeting. He started by talking about the importance of recognizing talent within the organization and how excited he was to announce some internal promotions. My heart started racing because I figured this was it, the moment I'd been working toward for months. Jonah talked about how one particular team member had demonstrated exceptional dedication, innovative thinking, and the kind of strategic mindset that made them perfect for advancing to a senior role. He was building up this big announcement, and I could feel my co-workers glancing at me with knowing smiles, clearly expecting my name to come next. Then he said, "I'm thrilled to announce that Brandon will be joining our senior team, effective immediately." Brandon, who had been hired 6 months after me, had barely finished his probationary period and had been working on significantly smaller accounts than the ones I'd been managing. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. The entire room went silent, and I could see the confused looks on my co-workers' faces. Several people turned to look at me, clearly as shocked as I was by this unexpected turn. Brandon himself looked surprised, like he hadn't been expecting this announcement either. After the meeting, I asked to speak with Jonah privately. I tried to keep my tone professional while asking for feedback about why I hadn't been selected for the position. He gave me vague responses about Brandon bringing fresh perspective and having different strengths that made him the right fit for the role. When I pressed for more specific feedback about what I could improve for future opportunities, Jonah became uncomfortable and said he'd schedule a follow-up meeting to discuss my professional development. That meeting never happened, despite me following up twice about scheduling it. The most frustrating part was how Jonah acted like nothing had changed between us after that day. He continued assigning me complex projects and relying on my experience with difficult clients. But now, Brandon was technically my superior, despite having less experience and knowledge about our existing accounts. Brandon, to his credit, seemed aware that the situation was awkward. He didn't try to micromanage me or act like he knew more than he did, but the dynamic was still weird. I found myself training someone who was supposedly above me in the company hierarchy, explaining processes and client relationships that I'd been managing long before he arrived. My co-workers were supportive, but didn't know what to say about the situation. A few mentioned privately that they'd been expecting me to get the promotion and were surprised by Jonah's choice. One colleague told me she'd overheard Jonah talking to HR about wanting to bring in new energy to the senior team, which felt like code for passing over people who'd been there longer. I started questioning whether there were factors beyond my performance that had influenced the decision. Was it about age, personality fit, or some other consideration that hadn't been part of the official criteria? The lack of clear feedback made it impossible to know what I could have done differently or what to focus on improving. 3 months later, I'm still in the same role, still handling the same responsibilities, but now watching Brandon learn on the job in a position I'd been ready to step into immediately. Jonah continues to rely on my institutional knowledge and client relationships while officially recognizing someone else as the senior team member. The whole experience has made me reconsider my future with this company. If merit and experience aren't the primary factors in advancement decisions, then I'm not sure what path forward exists for me here. I've started quietly exploring opportunities elsewhere, which feels disappointing after investing so much time and effort in building my career at this firm. That story is over. Getting hyped up in front of the entire team only to hear someone else's name called is workplace humiliation at its finest. The second-hand embarrassment from everyone expecting one outcome and getting blindsided by another must have been excruciating. Nothing quite says we value your contributions like promoting the person with half your experience while keeping you around to train them. Our next story involves someone who discovered that their partner has a very interesting definition of what constitutes appropriate communication with an ex. My partner still texts their ex, "Good morning," every day. I've been with Rosa for 8 months now, and our relationship has been pretty solid overall. We communicate well, have similar interests, and I genuinely enjoy spending time with her. But there's one thing that's been bothering me more and more as time goes on. Rosa texts her ex-boyfriend, "Good morning," every single day. Not occasionally, not when something reminds her of him, but literally every morning, like clockwork. I first noticed it about 3 months into our relationship when I was staying over and saw her phone light up with a response to what she'd apparently sent earlier. When I asked about it casually, Rosa explained that she and her ex had dated for 2 years and remained friends after their breakup 6 months before we met. She said they'd developed this routine of checking in with each other daily, and she saw it as just being polite and maintaining their friendship. At first, I tried to be understanding about it. I don't have issues with people staying friends with their exes in general, and Rosa seemed transparent about their communication. She never hid her phone or acted secretive when messages came through, which I appreciated. But as weeks turned into months, the daily good morning texts started feeling like more than just casual friendship maintenance. There's something intimate about that first thing in the morning communication that feels like it should be reserved for current relationships, not past ones. I started paying attention to the pattern, and it's remarkably consistent. Rosa wakes up, reaches for her phone, and sends that good morning text before we even have a conversation about our plans for the day. Sometimes I feel like her ex gets more intentional daily attention than I do as her actual boyfriend. When I brought up my concerns about the frequency and timing of these messages, Rosa got defensive. She said I was being insecure and controlling, that their friendship was completely platonic, and that she shouldn't have to end a meaningful relationship just because I was uncomfortable with it. She insisted that the good morning texts were just part of their established routine and didn't mean anything romantic or inappropriate. Rosa compared it to saying good morning to a co-worker or family member, just a polite way to acknowledge someone and start the day positively. But the comparison didn't sit right with me because she doesn't text her co-workers or family members good morning every single day. This level of consistent daily communication seems reserved specifically for her ex, which makes it feel different from other friendships she maintains. I tried to imagine how I'd feel if the situation were reversed, if I were texting an ex-girlfriend good morning every day while dating Rosa. I'm pretty sure she wouldn't be okay with that arrangement, which made her insistence that it was completely normal feel a bit hypocritical. The issue came to a head last week when Rosa's ex texted her good morning while we were having breakfast together. Instead of acknowledging me or our conversation, she immediately picked up her phone to respond to his message. It felt like he was being prioritized over the person actually sitting across from her. When I pointed out how that moment had made me feel, Rosa said I was being dramatic and reading too much into a simple text exchange. She accused me of trying to isolate her from her friends and said she was disappointed that I couldn't trust her judgment about appropriate boundaries. But I don't think this is really about trust or isolation. It's about the fact that daily communication with an ex creates an ongoing emotional connection that competes with current relationships. Even if the content is innocent, the consistency and priority given to these messages sends a certain message about where her attention and energy are focused. Rosa has made it clear that she's not willing to change this routine, and she sees my discomfort as something I need to work through on my own, rather than a legitimate relationship concern that deserves discussion and compromise. I'm left wondering if I'm being unreasonable for feeling uncomfortable with this arrangement, or if Rosa is being inconsiderate by maintaining such regular contact with her ex while we're trying to build something together. The whole situation has created this underlying tension that affects how I feel about our relationship overall. That story ends there. The just being polite defense for daily good morning texts to an ex is quite the mental gymnastics routine. Starting every day by reaching out to a former romantic partner, while your current partner sits right there, says everything about priorities. Some people really think maintaining intimate communication patterns with exes is just casual friendship maintenance. Our next story shows us that friendship sometimes means learning to share things you never intended to share. My friend ate my birthday dessert before I could even try it. I turned 27 last month, and I'd been planning this small birthday dinner for weeks. Nothing fancy, just 8 close friends at my apartment with homemade food and good conversation. I'd spent the entire day cooking everyone's favourite dishes and preparing this elaborate chocolate cake that I'd been excited to make since I saw the recipe online 3 months ago. The cake was this 3-layer masterpiece with dark chocolate ganache and raspberry filling. I'd never attempted anything that complex before, but I wanted to do something special for my own birthday. It took me almost 4 hours from start to finish, and I was genuinely proud of how it turned out. It looked like something from a professional bakery. My friend Mira arrived early to help set up, which I appreciated since she's always been good about pitching in when I host gatherings. She helped arrange furniture and set up plates and napkins, while I finished the last few preparations in the kitchen. Everything was going smoothly, and I was looking forward to finally relaxing and enjoying the evening with everyone. As guests started arriving, I put the finishing touches on dinner and got everything ready to serve. The cake was sitting on the counter, and I'd placed a few candles around it to make the presentation special. Several people complimented how amazing it looked and said they couldn't wait to try it after dinner. We had a great meal with lots of laughter and catching up. Everyone seemed to be having a good time, and the food turned out better than I'd expected. As we were clearing the dinner dishes, people started asking about dessert and singing happy birthday. I was excited to finally cut into the cake I'd worked so hard on. When I walked into the kitchen to get the cake, I found Mira standing at the counter with a fork in her hand and a guilty expression on her face. She'd cut herself a large corner piece and was actively eating it. chocolate ganache smeared around her mouth. The beautiful presentation I'd spent so much time on was ruined, with a jagged chunk missing from one side. I stood there staring at her, not sure what to say. All my friends were waiting in the dining room for the birthday cake, and here was Mira demolishing it before the actual celebration had even started. When she saw me, she paused mid-bite and said, "Oh, I thought we were sharing. It looked so good I couldn't resist." But we weren't sharing yet. The whole point was to cut it together as part of the birthday celebration. I'd been looking forward to that moment all day, and she'd just taken it upon herself to start eating without waiting for anyone else or asking if it was okay. I tried to salvage the situation by cutting around the damaged area and serving the rest of the cake to everyone else, but the presentation was completely ruined. Instead of this beautiful centerpiece for my birthday celebration, we had this lopsided, partially eaten dessert that looked like it had been attacked by a wild animal. When I mentioned to Mira later that I'd been hoping to cut the cake together as part of the birthday celebration, she seemed surprised that I was upset. She said she thought I'd be happy that she was enjoying something I'd made, and that she didn't realize there was a specific protocol for when dessert could be eaten. But it wasn't about protocol, it was about basic consideration and reading the room. When someone spends hours making an elaborate birthday cake and has it displayed as the centerpiece of their celebration, maybe don't start eating it before the birthday person has even had a chance to see everyone's reaction, or take photos, or do any of the traditional birthday cake activities. The worst part was that Mira took such a large piece that there wasn't enough left for everyone to have a proper serving. A couple of guests ended up with tiny slivers because she'd helped herself to what should have been portions for 2 or 3 people. When I brought this up, Mira said she hadn't realised how much she'd taken and offered to go buy ice cream from the store to make up for the shortage. But that missed the point entirely. The issue wasn't that we didn't have enough dessert, it was that she'd thoughtlessly damaged something I'd put significant effort into creating for a special occasion. The whole incident cast a weird shadow over the rest of the evening. Every time someone complimented the cake, I felt this pang of frustration, remembering how it was supposed to look before Mira got to it. What should have been a proud moment of sharing something I'd created became a reminder of how inconsiderate people can be. That story ends right there. Imagine working 4 hours on a birthday masterpiece only to find your friend treating your kitchen like a free buffet before the celebration even started. The "I thought we were sharing" defense while actively destroying someone's birthday cake is peak obliviousness. Some people really think consideration is optional when there's chocolate involved. Moving to family dynamics that prove blood doesn't always make people more reasonable. My sibling hid my shoes before a job interview. I had the most important job interview of my career scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. This was for a position I'd been working toward for months, with a company I genuinely wanted to work for. I'd prepared extensively, researched the organisation, practiced my responses to common questions, and even bought a new outfit specifically for the occasion. My sister Leah has always had what she calls a playful sense of humour, but her idea of playful often involves other people being inconvenienced or embarrassed. Growing up, she'd hide my homework or move my alarm clock to make me late for school, always claiming it was just innocent fun when I got in trouble. The night before my interview, I laid out everything I planned to wear, including my best dress shoes that I'd polished until they looked brand new. I wanted every detail to be perfect because I knew first impressions mattered, especially in the competitive field I was trying to break into. That morning, I woke up early to give myself plenty of time to get ready without feeling rushed. I showered, got dressed, ate a light breakfast, and went through my mental checklist of everything I needed to remember during the interview. I felt prepared and confident, which was exactly the mindset I wanted to have going into such an important meeting. With 20 minutes before I needed to leave for my interview, I went to put on my dress shoes, and they were nowhere to be found. I checked under my bed, in my closet, by the front door, everywhere I could think of where I might have left them. They had completely vanished. I started to panic because these were the only professional shoes I owned that went with my interview outfit. My sneakers would look completely inappropriate, and my casual flats would send the wrong message about how seriously I was taking this opportunity. With 15 minutes left before I needed to leave, I was frantically searching through every room in the house. I asked Leah if she'd seen my shoes anywhere, and she said she hadn't noticed them. She was eating cereal at the kitchen table, acting completely normal, not offering to help me search or seeming concerned that I was obviously stressed about being late for something important. With 10 minutes left, I was starting to accept that I might have to wear inappropriate footwear to my interview or call to reschedule, which would make me look unprofessional and unreliable. I was literally putting on my backup flats when Leah casually mentioned that she might have moved my shoes somewhere safe so they wouldn't get scuffed. When I demanded to know where they were, she led me to the basement laundry room where she'd hidden them behind the washing machine. She acted like this was a helpful gesture, saying she was protecting them from getting damaged, but the timing made it clear this was another one of her jokes designed to stress me out at the worst possible moment. I had less than 5 minutes to get to the bus stop, which meant I had to sprint in my freshly polished dress shoes while carrying my portfolio and trying not to sweat through my interview outfit. I made it to the bus with literally 30 seconds to spare, but I arrived at my interview feeling frazzled and out of breath instead of calm and collected. When I confronted Leah about the incident later, she insisted it had been a joke and that she didn't realise I had something important that morning. But she knew about my interview because I'd been talking about it for days, asking family members to wish me luck and expressing how nervous and excited I was about the opportunity. She said I was overreacting and that it had all worked out fine since I made it to my interview on time, but the point wasn't whether I technically made it on time, it was that she deliberately created stress and chaos right before one of the most important professional moments of my life. The interview itself went well despite the chaotic start, and I did end up getting the job. But I still feel frustrated when I think about how Leah's joke could have derailed an opportunity I'd worked so hard to earn. The fact that she still doesn't see anything wrong with her timing or her choice to hide something I needed makes it even more aggravating. That story is over. Nothing says sisterly love quite like sabotaging someone's biggest career opportunity for a laugh. The basement laundry room shoe relocation service strikes at the worst possible moment. Some people really think other people's stress is peak entertainment. Our next tale comes from someone who learned that some co-workers have mastered the art of looking productive while doing absolutely nothing. My co-worker pretends to be busy, but leaves me with all the work. I work in a small marketing department with just 4 people, so everyone's contribution really matters to keep projects moving smoothly. My co-worker Juliet has perfected this elaborate performance of being incredibly busy and overwhelmed while somehow never actually completing any substantial work. Juliet always arrives at the office carrying multiple notebooks, folders, and her laptop, looking like she's prepared for the most productive day imaginable. She'll spread all these materials across her desk in this very organised, purposeful way that gives the impression she's about to tackle some major project. Throughout the day, she walks around the office with a clipboard, stopping at different desks to have brief conversations with people about various work topics. She'll nod seriously, take notes, and generally appear to be coordinating important business activities. To anyone casually observing, Juliet looks like the most engaged and hardworking person in the department. But when it comes to actual deliverables, somehow nothing substantial ever comes from all this apparent activity. Projects that should be collaborative efforts end up falling entirely on my shoulders because Juliet is always too busy with other urgent matters to contribute her expected portion. When we're assigned joint responsibilities, Juliet will immediately start talking about all the preliminary research and planning she needs to do before she can begin the actual work. She'll spend days creating elaborate outlines and project timelines, but somehow never transitions from planning to execution. Meanwhile, I end up handling not just my own tasks, but also covering for the work Juliet was supposed to contribute. When deadlines approach and clients expect completed projects, I can't just explain that my co-worker was too busy planning to actually do anything productive. The most frustrating part is how Juliet manages to give the impression that she's carrying a heavier workload than anyone else. She'll sigh dramatically about how overwhelmed she is, mention staying late to catch up on things, and generally act like she's on the verge of burning out from all her responsibilities. Our supervisor seems completely convinced by Juliet's performance. During team meetings, Juliet will give these detailed updates about all the research she's been doing and the strategic thinking she's been applying to various projects. She's articulate and knowledgeable when discussing work concepts, which makes her sound incredibly productive and valuable. But when you actually look at measurable outcomes, there's a huge discrepancy between the amount of activity Juliet generates and the amount of completed work she produces. She's mastered the art of looking busy without actually accomplishing anything substantial. Last month we had a major client presentation that required extensive preparation and coordination. Juliet immediately volunteered to take the lead on organising our materials and creating the presentation framework. She spent 2 weeks having planning meetings, creating detailed outlines, and discussing strategy with various team members. The day before our presentation, I realised that Juliet had created beautiful organisational structures and comprehensive plans, but hadn't actually produced any of the content we needed to present to the client. All her planning and coordinating had resulted in empty slide templates and bullet points with no substance behind them. I ended up working until 2 a.m. to create the actual presentation content, using Juliet's framework, but having to develop all the analysis, recommendations, and supporting materials myself. The presentation went well, and our client was impressed with the thoroughness and quality of our work. During the post-presentation debrief, Juliet talked about how satisfied she was with our collaborative process and how well our planning and coordination had paid off. She took credit for the strategic approach and organizational structure, while I received recognition for the detailed analysis and content development. But the reality was that I had done both the strategic work and the detailed execution, while Juliet had contributed elaborate planning documents that ultimately served as expensive procrastination. Her planning process had been so time-consuming and involved that it gave the appearance of substantial contribution without actually advancing our project toward completion. When I tried to address this pattern with Juliet directly, she seemed genuinely confused by my concerns. She insisted that her planning and coordination work was essential to our team's success, and that I was undervaluing the strategic contributions she made to our projects. She pointed out all the meetings she attended, the research she conducted, and the organizational systems she created as evidence of her productivity. From her perspective, she was working just as hard as anyone else, maybe harder because she was handling so many different aspects of our projects simultaneously. That story ends right there. The clipboard-carrying, meeting-attending, planning-obsessed co-worker who never actually produces anything is a workplace classic. Mastering the art of looking busy while accomplishing nothing is truly a skill, just not one that helps anyone else get their work done. Some people have turned procrastination into performance art. Let's move into relationship territory, where some people have interesting ideas about appropriate dinner conversation. My partner compared me to their ex in front of friends. Kai and I have been together for about 10 months, and overall our relationship has been really positive. We have good chemistry, similar interests, and I genuinely enjoy spending time with him. But last weekend, something happened that made me question whether he really understands how to be considerate in a relationship. We were having dinner with 3 of his close friends at this nice Italian restaurant downtown. The conversation was flowing naturally. Everyone was having a good time, and I felt comfortable with his friend group, which had taken some time since they'd all known each other for years before I came into the picture. I'd made this pasta dish with homemade sauce the week before when Kai came over for dinner, and I was pretty proud of how it turned out. Cooking isn't my strongest skill, but I'd been working on improving, and This particular dish had been a real success. Kai had complimented it extensively at the time, and even asked for the recipe to share with his roommate. When our entrees arrived at the restaurant, Kai ordered the same type of pasta I'd made for him the previous week. One of his friends commented on how good it looked, and Kai started talking about how much he loved this particular dish, and how it was one of his absolute favourites. That's when he said, "My ex used to make this all the time, and she was incredible at it. Like restaurant quality, she'd make it way better than this." He gestured at his plate and then looked at me with this casual expression, like he'd just made some innocent observation about food preparation. The entire table went silent. His friends looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that he'd just said something completely inappropriate. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment, not just because he'd criticized my cooking in comparison to his ex, but because he'd done it so publicly and seemed completely unaware of how hurtful that was. I tried to laugh it off and change the subject, but the damage was done. For the rest of dinner, I felt self-conscious and hurt, replaying his comment and wondering how he could be so thoughtless about something I'd put effort into and been proud of. His friends seemed to sense the awkward atmosphere and made extra effort to include me in conversation and compliment other things, which was nice of them, but also made it clear that everyone except Kai had recognized how inappropriate his comment was. On the drive home, I brought up how his comparison had made me feel. Kai seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset and said he hadn't meant anything negative by it. He insisted he was just making conversation about food and didn't understand why I was taking it so personally. When I explained that comparing my cooking unfavourably to his ex's in front of his friends was hurtful and embarrassing, Kai said I was being too sensitive. He argued that he was just stating facts about his preferences and that I should appreciate his honesty rather than getting offended. But there's a difference between honest feedback and unnecessary comparisons that serve no purpose other than to make someone feel inadequate. If he had issues with my cooking, there were private, constructive ways to address that without bringing his ex into the conversation or embarrassing me in front of people I was trying to build relationships with. The worst part was his complete lack of awareness about why the comment was problematic. Even after I explained how it made me feel, Kai maintained that I was overreacting to what he considered a casual observation. He seemed to think that because his intention wasn't malicious, the impact of his words didn't matter. I've been thinking about this incident for a week now, and it's made me more aware of other times when Kai has made thoughtless comments without considering how they might affect me. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a pattern of him prioritizing his own comfort and expression over my feelings. When I tried to discuss this broader pattern with Kai, he became defensive and accused me of analysing everything he says and looking for reasons to be upset. He said relationships shouldn't require him to constantly monitor his words and that I needed to develop thicker skin if we were going to work long term. But I don't think expecting basic consideration and awareness from a partner is the same as requiring constant self-monitoring. There are certain things that are obviously hurtful to say, and comparing your current partner unfavourably to an ex in front of friends is definitely one of them. That story ends right there. Nothing quite kills dinner conversation like a casual comparison to the ex who apparently cooked like a Michelin star chef. The complete shock from his friends says everything about how inappropriate that moment was. Some people really think just being honest is an excuse for being tactless. Speaking of family members who don't understand appropriate timing, this next story involves someone who decided a graduation party was the perfect venue for their own announcement. My aunt tried to take over my graduation party to announce her engagement. I graduated college last month with a degree I'd worked incredibly hard for over 4 years. My parents decided to throw me a celebration party at our house, inviting extended family and close friends to acknowledge this milestone that meant so much to our whole family. My Aunt Hugo has always been someone who needs to be the centre of attention at family gatherings. She's the type of person who interrupts other people's stories to share her own experiences, turns every conversation back to herself, and generally makes everything about her personal drama or achievements. The graduation party was supposed to be a relaxed afternoon celebration with good food, family time, and recognition of my academic accomplishment. My parents had put effort into making it special, with a photo display of my college years, my favourite foods, and decorations in my school colours. About an hour into the party, when people were mingling and enjoying themselves, Hugo stood up and tapped her glass to get everyone's attention. She announced that she had some exciting news to share with the family, while everyone was gathered together in one place. I assumed she was going to say something nice about my graduation, or maybe share a family memory related to my college experience. Instead, she launched into this elaborate announcement about how her boyfriend had proposed to her the week before, and she wanted to share her joy with all of us on such a special family occasion. She pulled out her engagement ring, which she'd apparently been hiding all afternoon, and started showing it around to everyone. People immediately shifted their attention from my graduation celebration to Hugo's engagement news, asking to see the ring and hear details about the proposal. Within minutes, my graduation party had essentially become Hugo's engagement announcement party. Conversations that had been focused on my college experience and future plans suddenly became entirely about wedding planning, venue ideas, and speculation about Hugo's timeline for getting married. My parents looked mortified but didn't know how to redirect attention back to the original purpose of the gathering without seeming rude or unsupportive of Hugo's happy news. They tried to bring up graduation-related topics, but everyone was too excited about the engagement to focus on anything else. The worst part was how Hugo framed her announcement as contributing to the family celebration rather than hijacking it. She kept saying things like, "What a perfect day for good news," and "This makes the celebration even more special," as if she was enhancing my party rather than completely redirecting it. When family members started discussing potential wedding dates and asking Hugo about her plans, she basked in all the attention and acted like this was exactly how she'd hoped the announcement would go. She seemed completely oblivious to the fact that she'd essentially stolen the spotlight from someone else's milestone celebration. I spent the rest of my own graduation party listening to wedding conversations and watching Hugo show off her ring to relatives who had come specifically to celebrate my college achievement. Every attempt to bring the focus back to graduation felt awkward and forced because Hugo had successfully shifted the entire energy of the gathering. After most of the guests had left, I mentioned to Hugo that I wished she'd given me a heads up about her announcement so we could have planned separate celebrations for both occasions. She seemed genuinely confused by this suggestion and said she thought sharing her good news would make my party even more memorable and special. She insisted that having two celebrations happening at once was better than having separate events, and that she'd chosen my graduation party specifically because she wanted to share her happiness with family members who were already gathered together. But that missed the point entirely. My graduation party was supposed to be about acknowledging my accomplishment and celebrating this important transition in my life. By making her engagement announcement the main event, Hugo had turned my celebration into her stage, leaving me feeling like a supporting character at my own party. When I tried to explain this to her, Hugo said I was being selfish and that family should be happy to share in each other's joy rather than requiring separate celebrations for every milestone. She made it sound like I was being petty for wanting my graduation party to actually focus on my graduation. The whole experience left me feeling disappointed and frustrated. Instead of ending my college career with a meaningful celebration surrounded by family support, I ended it watching someone else take over my party to announce their own good news. That story ends there. The graduation party engagement announcement takeover is family selfishness at its peak. Turning someone else's milestone celebration into your personal announcement stage takes serious commitment to making everything about yourself. Some people really think sharing joy means stealing someone else's spotlight, Our final story for tonight takes us into workplace territory, where some bosses have truly creative interpretations of labour laws. My boss refused to pay me overtime because I should be grateful to work there. I work at a small non-profit organisation that helps connect community resources with families in need. It's meaningful work that I genuinely care about. But like most non-profit jobs, the pay isn't great and the workload can be overwhelming during busy periods. My supervisor Owen has this philosophy that working for a cause-driven organisation should be its own reward, and that employees should feel privileged to contribute to such important community work. He regularly reminds staff that we're not here to get rich, but to make a difference in people's lives. Last month, we had a major grant deadline that required extensive documentation and reporting. The project had been underfunded from the start, which meant our small team was responsible for work that really should have required twice as many people to complete properly within the timeline we'd been given. For 3 weeks straight, I worked 12-hour days and came in on weekends to ensure we met all the requirements and submitted everything on time. This wasn't optional overtime, or me choosing to work extra hours for additional pay. This was mandatory work that had to be completed to maintain our organisation's funding. By the end of those 3 weeks, I had accumulated over 40 hours of overtime, which according to federal labour law should have been compensated at time and a half my regular hourly rate. When I submitted my timesheet with the overtime hours documented, I expected it to be processed normally, like any other payroll period. Instead, Owen called me into his office to discuss what he called irregularities in my time reporting. He said he'd noticed I'd claimed a significant amount of overtime and wanted to understand why I felt entitled to additional compensation for work that was part of my regular job responsibilities. When I explained that the extra hours were necessary to meet the grant deadline and that overtime pay is legally required for hourly employees working more than 40 hours per week, Owen seemed annoyed by what he called my mercenary attitude toward our mission-driven work. He told me that when someone chooses to work for a non-profit, they're making a commitment to the cause that goes beyond typical employer-employee relationships. He said the organisation had given me an opportunity to contribute to important community work, and that I should view any extra hours as an investment in my own professional development. Owen suggested that instead of focusing on overtime compensation, I should be grateful for the experience I'd gained managing such an important project under pressure. He said this kind of hands-on responsibility would be valuable for my career growth, and that many people would pay for the kind of learning opportunity I'd been given. When I pointed out that gratitude doesn't pay my rent, and that labour laws exist to protect workers regardless of the type of organisation they work for, Owen became defensive. He said he was disappointed by my failure to understand the spirit of non-profit work and my focus on monetary compensation over mission alignment. He then informed me that the organisation's budget couldn't accommodate overtime payments, and that if I wasn't willing to occasionally work extra hours without additional compensation, maybe I wasn't the right fit for their team culture. I researched labour law requirements and discovered that non-profit organisations are subject to the same overtime regulations as any other employer. The fact that an organisation has a charitable mission doesn't exempt them from paying employees fairly for their time and work. When I brought this information to Owen and requested that my overtime hours be properly compensated, he accused me of being adversarial and threatening legal action against an organisation that was trying to help vulnerable community members. He made it sound like pursuing fair compensation was somehow betraying the families we served. Owen also suggested that my focus on legal requirements showed a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to work in the non-profit sector. He said that people who are truly committed to social justice don't nickel and dime organisations that are struggling to make ends meet while serving the community. The conversation became increasingly uncomfortable as Owen implied that requesting legal compliance with wage laws was somehow unethical or greedy. He painted my overtime claim as taking resources away from the families we help, as if paying employees fairly and serving clients were mutually exclusive goals. When I explained that working unpaid overtime wasn't sustainable for me financially, and that the organisation needed to budget properly for the labour required to meet their commitments, Owen said I was being unrealistic about non-profit operations and should consider whether this field was right for me. He offered what he called a compromise. Instead of overtime pay, he could provide me with a glowing letter of recommendation and serve as a reference for future job applications. He presented this as generous compensation that would be more valuable than money in the long term. But letters of recommendation don't pay bills or compensate me for the 3 weeks of 12-hour days I'd worked to meet the grant deadline. The idea that professional development opportunities could substitute for legally required wages was both insulting and financially impractical. I ended up filing a complaint with the Department of Labour because Owen made it clear he had no intention of paying the overtime I'd earned. The investigation found that the organisation had violated federal wage laws, not just with my case but with several other employees who'd been working unpaid overtime under similar circumstances. The organisation was required to pay all back wages and penalties, which created a significant financial burden they hadn't budgeted for. Owen blamed me for damaging the organisation's finances and creating difficulties for their ability to serve clients, even though the problem was caused by their illegal employment practices. Several co-workers thanked me privately for filing the complaint because they'd been working unpaid overtime for months, but were afraid to speak up. They'd been told similar things about being grateful for the opportunity and prioritising mission over money, creating an environment where wage theft was normalised as organisational culture. Owen's attitude never changed, even after the Department of Labour ruling. He continued to act like I'd betrayed the organisation's mission by insisting on legal compliance with employment laws. He made my work environment so uncomfortable that I eventually found a different job at an organisation that actually follows labour regulations. The whole experience taught me that some employers will exploit workers' passion for meaningful work by framing fair compensation as greed or disloyalty. Just because an organisation has a good mission doesn't mean they get to ignore basic employment laws or guilt employees into accepting wage theft. That story ends right there. Using the "you should be grateful to work here" defence while literally stealing wages is management gaslighting at its finest. Turning legal compliance into a moral failing takes serious mental gymnastics. Some bosses really think having a good cause gives them permission to break employment laws. Moving on to friendship dynamics that test the limits of what people consider acceptable behaviour. My friend left me alone at a club with no ride home. Going out with my friend Ethan usually involves pretty standard weekend activities, so when he invited me to check out this new club downtown last Saturday, I figured it would be a typical night of drinks, dancing, and catching up over loud music. Ethan picked me up at my apartment around 10 p.m, and we headed to the club together. The plan was simple: have some fun, stay out for a few hours, and he'd drive me home at the end of the night since I don't have a car and had counted on him for transportation both ways. The club was packed with a good crowd and decent music, exactly the kind of atmosphere we'd been hoping for. We found a spot at the bar, ordered drinks, and started talking to some people who seemed friendly enough. Everything was going normally until Ethan started getting particularly chatty with a group of strangers who'd apparently just moved to town. These newcomers were enthusiastic about exploring the local nightlife scene, and they kept suggesting other places they wanted to check out before the night was over. They had this energy of people who are treating the entire city like their personal playground, which can be fun to be around, but also somewhat exhausting. Around midnight, one of them suggested moving the party to some after-hours place across town that supposedly had better music and cheaper drinks. Ethan immediately got excited about the idea and started talking about how adventurous it would be to explore somewhere new with people who knew how to have a good time. When I mentioned that I was getting tired and maybe ready to head home soon, Ethan said the night was just getting started and that I should be more spontaneous. The strangers chimed in, saying I seemed cool and should definitely come along to continue the fun at this other location. But something about the whole situation felt off to me. These were people we'd known for less than 2 hours, suggesting we go to some place none of us had ever been, with no real plan for how the evening would unfold from there. It felt like the kind of impulsive decision that could easily go wrong in multiple ways. I told Ethan I preferred to stick with our original plan and asked if he was ready to leave. He said he wasn't ready to end the night yet, and that I could either come along to the after-hours place or figure out my own way home. He said it casually, like this was a reasonable suggestion rather than abandoning the person he'd driven to the club. When I reminded him that I'd been counting on him for a ride home and didn't have another way to get back to my apartment, Ethan said I could call a rideshare or take public transportation. He seemed annoyed that I was trying to limit his fun by sticking to our original agreement about him driving me home. The strangers were getting impatient to leave for their next destination, and Ethan was clearly torn between honouring his commitment to me and pursuing what he saw as a more exciting opportunity. Unfortunately, he chose the strangers and the after-hours adventure over his responsibility to get me home safely. He left with them around 12:30, leaving me alone at a crowded club with no transportation plan and no way to contact him once his phone inevitably died later in the night. I spent the next hour figuring out alternative transportation options and eventually got home around 2 a.m. after waiting for a rideshare during peak weekend demand. The next morning, Ethan texted me asking if I'd gotten home okay, as if his concern was touching rather than something that should have been handled in real time the night before. When I told him I was upset about being abandoned, he said I was being dramatic and that adults should be able to figure out their own transportation. He insisted that he'd presented me with options and that I'd chosen to stay at the club rather than come along to the after-hours place. In his mind, I'd made the decision to separate from the group, which somehow absolved him of any responsibility for ensuring I got home safely, but that completely ignored the fact that our original plan involved him driving me home, and that I'd made my evening plans based on that agreement. Deciding he'd rather go somewhere else with strangers didn't change his commitment to provide the transportation he'd promised. When I explained this to Ethan, he said I was being too rigid about plans and that spontaneous adventures are what make going out fun. He seemed to view his decision to ditch me as embracing life's possibilities rather than abandoning a friend who trusted him for a safe ride home. That story ends right there. The "you should be more" spontaneous defense while abandoning someone without transportation is peak friend betrayal. Choosing random strangers over the person who trusted you for a ride home says everything about priorities. Some people really think adulting means ditching your commitments whenever something more exciting comes along. Let's dive into a story about modern technology and family boundaries that apparently don't exist. My cousin used my Netflix account and changed the password. My relationship with my cousin Clint has always been pretty casual. We see each other at family gatherings maybe 3 or 4 times a year, exchange pleasantries, and generally maintain that friendly, but not particularly close dynamic that exists between extended family members who didn't grow up together. About 6 months ago, Clint mentioned during a family barbecue that he was frustrated with the cost of streaming services and had been thinking about cancelling some of his subscriptions to save money. It was a conversation several of us were having since everyone seems to be feeling the pinch of inflation affecting everything from groceries to entertainment. I offhandedly mentioned that he could use my Netflix login if he wanted, since I rarely use all the simultaneous streams anyway, and figured it wouldn't hurt to share access with family. It seemed like a nice gesture that would help him save a few dollars without costing me anything extra. Clint seemed grateful for the offer and said he'd probably take me up on it occasionally when there was something specific he wanted to watch. I gave him my login information and didn't think much about it afterward, assuming he'd use it sparingly for the occasional movie or series. For the next few months, everything seemed normal. My Netflix recommendations got a little weird with action movies and reality shows I'd never watched, but I figured that was just the natural consequence of sharing an account. The algorithm would eventually readjust based on my viewing habits. 2 weeks ago, I tried to log into my Netflix account to catch up on a series I'd been watching and got an error message saying my password was incorrect. I assumed I'd mistyped it and tried again several times before realizing that something was actually wrong with my account access. When I tried to reset my password using the email recovery option, I discovered that the email address associated with my account had been changed to one I didn't recognize. Someone had essentially taken control of my Netflix account and locked me out of my own subscription. I called Netflix customer service and explained the situation, providing them with my payment information and account history to prove ownership. The representative was helpful and restored my access, but mentioned that the account had been accessed from multiple locations and devices over the past few months. Once I regained control of my account, I could see that it had been used extensively by people I didn't know. With viewing history showing dozens of shows and movies I'd never heard of being watched simultaneously across different profiles. Someone had essentially turned my personal Netflix subscription into a family plan for multiple households. I immediately suspected Clint, since he was the only person I'd shared my login information with, so I called him to ask what had happened. He confirmed that he'd been using the account but claimed he didn't know anything about the password being changed or other people gaining access. When I pressed him for more details, Clint admitted that he'd shared the login information with his girlfriend, his roommate, and a couple of friends who were also trying to save money on streaming services. He said he figured I wouldn't mind since I'd been generous enough to offer access in the first place, but there's a huge difference between letting one family member occasionally use your account and having that person distribute your login credentials to multiple strangers who then take over your subscription entirely. I'd offered to share access with Clint specifically, not to subsidize entertainment costs for his entire social circle. When I explained that his sharing had resulted in my account being compromised and me being locked out of my own Netflix subscription, Clint seemed surprised that I was upset. He said I was overreacting since the account was working fine for everyone who was using it, and that I could just create a new profile if I wanted to keep my viewing history separate. He also pointed out that when he comes over to visit family gatherings, he usually brings snacks or contributes to meals. So he felt like sharing my Netflix account was a fair exchange for his occasional food contributions. He seemed to genuinely believe that bringing chips to family barbecues entitled him to distribute my streaming service access to his friends. The logic was so flawed, it was almost impressive. Bringing snacks to family events that everyone enjoys is completely different from giving away someone else's paid subscription services to people they don't know. The two things aren't even remotely equivalent in terms of cost or personal impact. I changed my Netflix password again and made it clear to Clint that his access was revoked and that he needed to get his own subscription if he wanted to continue streaming. He seemed hurt by this decision and said he thought family was supposed to help each other out, especially when it didn't cost anything extra. That story ends right there. The I bring snacks sometimes justification for redistributing someone's paid streaming account to random friends is absolutely wild. Turning a simple favor into a community resource sharing program without permission takes serious entitlement. Some people really think casual generosity means unlimited access to everything you own. Our next story involves someone whose partner has a very unique approach to showing appreciation in relationships. My partner walks ahead of me in public like I don't exist. I've been dating Ivy for about 7 months now, and while most aspects of our relationship work well, there's this one behaviour that's been driving me increasingly crazy. Every time we go anywhere together, she walks at least 10 feet ahead of me, like we're complete strangers who happen to be heading in the same direction. At first I thought maybe she was just naturally a fast walker or excited about wherever we were going. But as weeks turned into months, I realised this was a consistent pattern that happened, regardless of the situation or location. Whether we're walking to a restaurant, through a shopping mall, or just strolling through the neighbourhood, Ivy maintains this distance between us that makes it clear we're not together. The most awkward part is how it looks to other people. Couples walking together is such a basic social norm that when someone consistently walks far ahead of their partner, it sends a message about the relationship dynamic. I've noticed other people giving us confused looks, probably wondering if we're having an argument or if there's some kind of tension between us. When I've tried to catch up and walk beside her, Ivy will speed up or find reasons to move ahead again. She'll say she needs to check something in a store window, or that she wants to see what's around the corner, always creating this physical separation that feels intentional rather than accidental. I finally brought up how this behaviour makes me feel, explaining that walking together is a simple way for couples to show they're connected and enjoying each other's company. Ivy's response was that I walk too slowly and that she doesn't want to be held back by my pace when we're trying to get somewhere. But this happens even when we're not in any hurry or trying to reach a specific destination. During casual walks where the whole point is to spend time together, she still maintains this distance that makes me feel like I'm following her around rather than walking with her as an equal partner. When I suggested we could find a comfortable pace that works for both of us, Ivy said I was being controlling and trying to dictate how she moves through public spaces. She made it sound like walking together was some kind of restrictive demand rather than a normal relationship behaviour. The issue came to a head last weekend when we went to a street festival together. Instead of exploring the booths and activities as a couple, I spent the entire afternoon trying to locate Ivy in the crowd because she disappeared ahead of me without saying where she was going. Several times vendors assumed I was alone and offered me information about finding someone to join me. When I finally found her at the end of the festival, Ivy seemed annoyed that I'd been looking for her and said I should have just enjoyed the event at my own pace instead of worrying about where she was. But the whole point of going to the festival together was to share the experience, not to attend the same event separately. I've started feeling like Ivy doesn't actually want to be seen with me in public, like she's embarrassed by our relationship, or prefers to appear single when we're out together. The physical distance creates an emotional distance that makes me question how she really feels about us as a couple. That story ends right there. Nothing says I love being with you quite like maintaining a 10-foot radius at all times. The street festival hide-and-seek situation sounds absolutely exhausting. Some people really think relationships work better when you pretend you don't know each other in public. Let's move to workplace dynamics that prove some people have very creative interpretations of professional behaviour. My co-worker brought their pet iguana to the office without telling anyone. I work in a fairly relaxed marketing office where people occasionally bring their dogs in on Fridays. So when my co-worker Jonas mentioned he might bring a pet to work sometime, I figured he was talking about a typical office-friendly animal. Nothing could have prepared me for what actually happened. Last Tuesday morning, I arrived at work to find Jonas setting up what looked like a small terrarium on his desk, complete with a heat lamp and some kind of artificial foliage. When I asked what he was doing, he casually mentioned that his iguana needed some social interaction and that working from home wasn't providing enough stimulation for the animal. The iguana, which Jonas introduced as Rodrigo, was about 3 feet long and had this unsettling way of staring at people with completely motionless eyes. Jonas seemed completely comfortable with this arrangement, talking to Rodrigo like they were having normal conversations and occasionally offering pieces of lettuce from his lunch. Our office manager wasn't in that day, so there was no immediate authority figure to address what was clearly a violation of workplace policies. Most of my co-workers seemed too stunned by the situation to say anything, and Jonas acted like bringing a large reptile to work was completely normal professional behaviour. Around mid-morning, Rodrigo decided to explore beyond the confines of Jonas's desk area. The iguana moved with surprising speed and agility, scaling filing cabinets and investigating various workstations, while Jonas remained focused on his computer tasks, apparently unconcerned about his pets wandering. The first real problem occurred when Rodrigo climbed onto my co-worker's desk and knocked over a full cup of coffee onto her keyboard and important client documents. The coffee spilled everywhere, destroying paperwork that had taken hours to prepare and potentially damaging expensive computer equipment. Jonas apologized for the incident, but seemed more concerned about whether Rodrigo had been startled by the commotion than about the actual damage his pet had caused. He offered to help clean up the mess, but spent most of the time trying to coax Rodrigo down from the top of a bookshelf where he'd taken refuge. The situation escalated when Rodrigo decided to investigate the break room during lunch hour. Several people were eating at the small tables when this large reptile suddenly appeared, causing one person to scream and another to drop their sandwich on the floor. The break room quickly emptied as people were unsure how to react to sharing their lunch space with an iguana. Jonas seemed baffled by everyone's reactions, insisting that Rodrigo was completely harmless and that people were overreacting to what he considered a friendly office visit. He pointed out that dogs come to work sometimes, and that iguanas are actually cleaner and quieter than most traditional pets. But there's a significant difference between a well-trained office dog and a 3-foot reptile that climbs on desks, knocks over drinks, and appears unexpectedly in communal spaces. The comparison was completely inappropriate and ignored the fact that most people aren't comfortable around large lizards in their workplace. When our office manager returned the next day and learned about the iguana incident, she was furious. Jonas was required to take Rodrigo home immediately and received a formal written warning about bringing unauthorized animals to work without prior approval from management. During the disciplinary meeting, Jonas argued that the employee handbook didn't specifically mention iguanas in the pet policy, only dogs and cats. He seemed to think this technicality meant his choice to bring a reptile to work was acceptable, despite the obvious disruption it had caused. The whole experience taught everyone in our office that some policies exist because common sense isn't actually that common. Jonas still occasionally mentions how unfair it was that Rodrigo was banned from the office while dogs are allowed, completely missing the point about appropriate workplace animals. That story is over. The mental image of a 3-foot iguana casually scaling office furniture while people try to work is absolutely hilarious. Comparing an iguana to office dogs while your pet is literally destroying keyboards shows impressive commitment to missing the point. Some people really think the handbook doesn't specifically say no iguanas is a valid legal defense. Moving into family territory where some relatives have interesting ideas about personal property. My sister gave away my childhood toys without asking. I moved out of my parents' house about 2 years ago, but like most people, I left some personal belongings in my childhood bedroom, including a collection of toys and memorabilia that had sentimental value to me. My sister Renee, who's 3 years younger than me, still lives at home, and apparently decided that my absence meant my stuff was fair game for disposal. Last month, I went back to my parents' house to visit for the weekend and wanted to show my girlfriend some of my old collectibles from when I was a kid. I had this collection of action figures, some vintage comic books, and a few special items that my grandparents had given me over the years. Nothing incredibly valuable monetarily, but things that held personal meaning and memories. When I went to my old room to retrieve some of these items, I discovered that most of my belongings were gone. The shelves that had been lined with carefully organised collectibles were completely empty, and several boxes that had contained comic books and other memorabilia had vanished entirely. I asked my parents what had happened to my stuff, and they seemed confused about what I was referring to. After some discussion, my mum mentioned that Renee had done some cleaning and organising a few weeks earlier, but she wasn't sure about the specific details of what had been moved or removed. When I confronted Renee about my missing belongings, she initially tried to act like she didn't know what I was talking about. But when I pressed for more information, she eventually admitted that she'd donated several boxes of what she called old junk to a local charity organisation. She said she'd been cleaning house and figured that since I hadn't taken those items with me when I moved out, they were probably things I didn't want anymore. Renee seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset about her decision to dispose of my personal property without asking. When I explained that those items had sentimental value and that some of them were gifts from family members who had since passed away, Renee said she was sorry, but that the stuff was already gone and there was nothing she could do about it now. She suggested that maybe I should have taken everything with me if it was really important. But that completely missed the point. Just because I didn't have space in my apartment for childhood collectibles didn't mean I wanted them thrown away. Leaving personal belongings at your parents' house is a normal part of transitioning to independent living, not an invitation for siblings to dispose of your property. The most frustrating part was that some of the items she'd donated were irreplaceable. A vintage action figure that my grandfather had given me before he died, some comic books from the 1990s that are no longer printed, and several handmade items that family members had created specifically for me over the years. I tried calling the charity organisation to see if any of my items were still available, but they said donations are sorted and distributed quickly, making it unlikely that I could recover anything specific. The volunteer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that they process hundreds of donations weekly and couldn't track individual items. When I expressed my frustration to my parents about Renee disposing of my belongings without permission, they said they wished she'd asked first, but that they couldn't undo what had already happened. They seemed to view it as a miscommunication rather than a serious violation of personal property rights. Renee continues to act like her actions were reasonable and that I'm overreacting to what she considers a simple mistake. She's offered to buy me new versions of some items, but that misses the entire point about sentimental value and irreplaceable memories associated with specific objects. The whole situation has damaged my trust in leaving anything at my parents' house and made me question whether Renee understands the concept of respecting other people's property, even when they're not physically present to protect it. That story ends right there. The "I thought it was junk because you didn't take it" defense while donating someone's childhood memories is peak sibling thoughtlessness. Losing irreplaceable gifts from deceased grandparents because your sister decided to play donation fairy is heartbreaking. Some people really think moving out means you've forfeited all rights to your personal belongings. Our next story involves friendship dynamics and the fine art of entertainment timing. My friend spoiled the ending of a show I waited years to watch. I have this friend Samir who's always been enthusiastic about television shows and movies, sometimes to the point where his excitement overrides his consideration for other people's viewing experiences. We often discuss what we're watching and recommend series to each other, which has generally been a nice way to share entertainment interests. For the past 3 years, I'd been hearing amazing things about this particular drama series that everyone seemed obsessed with. The problem was that it wasn't available on any of the streaming services I subscribed to, and I couldn't justify adding another monthly subscription just for one show, no matter how highly recommended it was. Finally, last month, the series became available on a platform I already had access to. I was genuinely excited to start watching something I'd been curious about for so long, especially since I'd managed to avoid spoilers despite the show's popularity and cultural impact over the years. The day the series appeared on my streaming service, I texted Samir to let him know I was finally going to start watching it that evening. I was looking forward to being able to participate in conversations about the show and understand all the references I'd been missing for years. Samir immediately called me, sounding thrilled that I was about to experience what he considered one of the best television series ever created. He started talking about how jealous he was that I got to watch it for the first time, and how he wished he could erase his memory and experience it fresh again. But then, in his enthusiasm, Samir blurted out the major twist ending that occurs in the final season. Not just a minor plot point or character development, but the central revelation that the entire series builds toward, and that completely recontextualizes everything that happens throughout the show. The moment the words left his mouth, Samir realized what he'd done. He immediately started apologizing and saying he hadn't meant to spoil anything, that he'd just gotten excited and wasn't thinking about the fact that I hadn't seen it yet. But the damage was completely done. I sat there holding my phone, feeling this crushing disappointment as I realized that the main mystery and emotional journey of the series had been ruined for me before I'd even watched the first episode. The thing I'd been most looking forward to about finally watching this show was discovering how the story unfolded and being surprised by its developments. Samir kept apologizing and suggesting that maybe I could still enjoy the show, even knowing the ending, that there were other elements worth appreciating beyond just the main plot twist. He said maybe knowing the ending would help me notice foreshadowing and subtle details that first-time viewers might miss. But that wasn't the experience I wanted to have with this particular series. Part of what made it special, according to everyone who'd recommended it, was the way it gradually revealed information and built toward its surprising conclusion. Watching it while already knowing the ending would be a completely different and diminished experience. When I explained how disappointed I was, Samir became defensive and said it was an accident, that he hadn't intentionally spoiled anything for me. He seemed to think that because his intention wasn't malicious, I shouldn't be upset about the results of his thoughtlessness. He also pointed out that the series had been over for 2 years and that most people had already seen it, implying that I shouldn't expect others to carefully avoid spoilers for something that was no longer current. But the age of the show didn't change the fact that it was new to me and that I'd been specifically looking forward to experiencing it fresh. I tried watching the first few episodes anyway, thinking maybe I could still enjoy the performances and production values, even knowing how everything would end. But every scene felt tainted by my knowledge of the conclusion, and I found myself analysing everything through the lens of information I wasn't supposed to have yet. After struggling through 3 episodes, I gave up on the series entirely. The experience of watching it while knowing the ending was too frustrating and felt like a waste of time. Samir had inadvertently robbed me of the opportunity to ever experience this highly acclaimed show the way it was meant to be experienced. That story is over. The crushing disappointment of waiting 3 years to watch something only to have the ending shouted at you before the first episode is genuinely tragic. There's nothing quite like that sinking feeling when someone accidentally destroys your entire viewing experience with their unfiltered enthusiasm. Some people really need to learn the difference between sharing excitement and sharing spoilers. Let's move into workplace territory, where some managers have truly innovative ideas about productivity. My boss made us do trust falls at 7 in the morning instead of working. I work for a mid-sized consulting firm where we typically start our workday around 8:30, so when my boss Elise sent an email requiring everyone to arrive at 7 a.m. for a mandatory team-building exercise, most of us assumed it would be something brief before getting into our regular work responsibilities. Elise has always been enthusiastic about workplace culture and team dynamics, often attending management seminars and coming back with new ideas about improving office morale and collaboration. Some of her initiatives have been helpful, like flexible lunch hours and casual Fridays, but others have felt more like solutions in search of problems. When we arrived at 7 that Tuesday morning, bleary-eyed and clutching coffee cups, Elise had rearranged our conference room to create an open space in the centre. She was dressed in athletic wear and had this energetic demeanour that felt completely at odds with how the rest of us were feeling at such an early hour. She announced that we were going to start the day with some physical team-building activities designed to build trust and communication between colleagues. Specifically, we were going to practice trust falls, where one person falls backward while trusting a partner to catch them before they hit the ground. The entire room went silent as people processed what they'd just heard. Several of my co-workers looked around at each other with expressions of disbelief, probably wondering if this was some kind of elaborate joke, or if Elise was serious about making us do trust falls before our morning meetings. Elise seemed oblivious to the general reluctance and started explaining the exercise in detail. She talked about how trust falls would help us develop confidence in our colleagues' reliability and create stronger bonds between team members who would be working on projects together. She demonstrated the proper technique with our office manager, who clearly felt obligated to participate since she was also in a supervisory role. Watching 2 adults in business attire practicing trust falls in a conference room at 7 in the morning was surreal and somewhat embarrassing for everyone involved. Then Elise started pairing people up and expecting everyone to take turns being the person who falls and the person who catches. Some of my co-workers tried to opt out by claiming back problems or other physical limitations, but Elise insisted that everyone needed to participate to achieve the full team building benefits. The exercise was awkward and uncomfortable on multiple levels. Most of us barely knew each other outside of professional contexts, and suddenly we were expected to engage in this intimate act of physical trust with people we usually only discussed spreadsheets and client presentations with. Several people were clearly worried about the safety aspects of catching a falling colleague, especially since we had no training in proper technique, and were doing this on a hard conference room floor rather than a padded surface designed for such activities. The whole thing felt more like a liability nightmare than a team-building success. One person did fall harder than expected when their partner wasn't quite ready, leading to some bruising and general concern about whether anyone could get injured and file a workers' compensation claim. By the time we finished the trustful exercise, it was 8:15, and we'd lost nearly an hour and a half of productive work time. Everyone was dishevelled, tired from getting up early, and generally not in the collaborative mood that Elise had apparently been hoping to create. When we finally transitioned to our actual work responsibilities, several clients had already called wondering why their morning meetings had been delayed. Elise seemed surprised that the team-building exercise had taken longer than expected and caused scheduling conflicts with our regular business operations. During our next staff meeting, I brought up concerns about mandatory physical activities and early morning requirements that weren't directly related to our job functions. Elise said she was disappointed by the team's lack of enthusiasm for innovative approaches to workplace collaboration. That story ends right there. Nothing builds workplace trust quite like forcing exhausted employees to catch each other at dawn in business attire. The mental image of a conference room full of consultants reluctantly doing trust falls is both hilarious and deeply uncomfortable. Some managers really think physical comedy is the key to professional success. Our final story for this section involves the complex world of relationship property rights and casual borrowing. My partner took my hoodie and gave it to their ex. I have this particular hoodie that's been my go-to comfort item for probably 4 years now. It's nothing fancy, just a soft grey pullover from a university bookstore. But it fits perfectly and has that worn-in feeling that makes it ideal for lazy weekends and cold evenings at home. My partner Noelle has borrowed this hoodie occasionally when she's staying over and gets cold, which I've never minded. It looks good on her, and sharing clothes is a pretty normal part of being in a relationship. I've worn her jackets and sweaters plenty of times when the situation called for it. Last weekend, Noelle mentioned that she was meeting up with her ex-boyfriend to return some books and personal items they'd been meaning to exchange since their breakup 8 months ago. She said it was just practical clean-up stuff, getting closure by returning things that belong to each other, which seemed reasonable and mature. When she came back from that meeting, I noticed she wasn't wearing the hoodie she'd put on before leaving. When I asked about it, Noelle said she'd given it to her ex because he'd commented on how nice it looked and mentioned being cold during their conversation. I was confused because that hoodie belonged to me, not her, so it wasn't hers to give away during their personal item exchange. When I pointed this out, Noelle seemed surprised that I was concerned about what she called just a hoodie and said her ex had seemed to really appreciate the gesture. She explained that he'd been going through a tough time lately and that the hoodie had made him feel better, like it was some kind of comfort item that had provided emotional support during their conversation. Noelle seemed to think this justified her decision to give away my clothing without asking. When I said I wanted my hoodie back, Noelle got defensive and accused me of being possessive about material objects. She said she was disappointed that I couldn't understand her desire to help someone who was struggling, even if that someone was her ex-boyfriend. But this wasn't about being possessive or unsupportive of people who were having difficult times. This was about her giving away my personal property without permission, regardless of who the recipient was or what their emotional state happened to be. I suggested that if she wanted to help her ex feel better, she could give him one of her own items or offer some other form of support that didn't involve my belongings. Noelle said I was being petty and materialistic, focusing on ownership instead of the bigger picture of human kindness. The bigger picture argument felt like a way to avoid taking responsibility for giving away something that belonged to me. If Noelle wanted to perform acts of kindness for her ex, that was her choice, but it shouldn't involve sacrificing my possessions without my consent. When I contacted her ex directly to ask about getting my hoodie back, he seemed genuinely confused about the situation. He said he'd assumed it belonged to Noelle and that she was giving him something of hers as a friendly gesture. He offered to return it immediately once he understood it was actually mine. Noelle was upset that I'd contacted her ex directly instead of working through her, but I pointed out that her approach had been to dismiss my concerns rather than help resolve the situation. Going directly to the source seemed like the most efficient way to recover my property. The whole incident made me question Noelle's understanding of relationship boundaries and respect for personal property. Even if the hoodie itself wasn't expensive or irreplaceable, the principle of giving away someone else's belongings without permission felt like a significant boundary violation. That story ends right there. The casual generosity with other people's favourite clothes is truly something special. Using someone's beloved hoodie as an emotional support donation to an ex while calling the owner materialistic for wanting it back is peak relationship logic. Some people really think it's just a hoodie applies to everyone's stuff except their own. Here's our next story, which proves that some people have fascinating definitions of what counts as harmless workplace pranks. My co-worker brought their pet iguana to the office without telling anyone. I work at a small tech company where the dress code is pretty casual and we have flexible policies about a lot of things, but I never imagined that would extend to exotic pets roaming freely through the workspace. My co-worker Jonas has always been a bit eccentric. He keeps succulents on his desk, wears vintage band t-shirts to client meetings, and has strong opinions about the optimal temperature for brewing coffee. I actually appreciate having someone around who brings personality to what could otherwise be a pretty sterile corporate environment. Last Tuesday started like any normal day. I arrived at the office around 9, grabbed my usual coffee, and settled in at my desk to tackle the project I'd been working on all week. Jonas was already there, which wasn't unusual since he tends to come in early to avoid traffic. What was unusual was the large terrarium-like setup he'd constructed on his desk, complete with a heat lamp and what looked like artificial plants. When I asked him about it, he mentioned that his pet needed some socialization and that working from home wasn't providing enough mental stimulation. I assumed he was talking about getting a fish or maybe a small bird. The setup looked professional enough, and Jonas seemed to have put real thought into creating an appropriate environment for whatever creature he'd decided to bring to work. Around 10:30, I was deep in concentration when I heard this scratching sound coming from Jonas's direction. When I looked over, I saw this massive green iguana climbing out of the terrarium and onto his desk. The thing was easily 3 feet long and moved with surprising confidence for an animal in an unfamiliar environment. Jonas seemed completely unbothered by his pet's exploration, continuing to type on his keyboard while the iguana investigated the various items on his desk. He occasionally offered pieces of lettuce from his lunch container, talking to the animal like they were having a normal conversation about work projects. My first thought was that surely this couldn't be allowed under company policy, but our office manager was at a conference all week, and there was no immediate authority figure to address what was clearly becoming a situation that needed addressing. The iguana, which Jonas introduced to anyone who asked as Rodrigo, seemed curious about the entire office environment. It started climbing onto other people's desks, investigating computer monitors, and generally treating our workspace like its personal jungle gym. Most of my co-workers were too stunned to know how to react. Some people thought it was kinda cool to have such an exotic animal around, while others were clearly uncomfortable but didn't want to seem uptight by complaining about Jonas's unconventional choice. The first real problem happened when Rodrigo decided to explore my desk while I was in a meeting. I came back to find that he'd knocked over my coffee mug, soaking through important client documents that I'd spent hours preparing. The liquid had also gotten into my keyboard, potentially damaging equipment that wasn't mine to replace. Jonas apologized for the incident, but seemed more concerned about whether the commotion had stressed Rodrigo than about the actual damage his pet had caused. He offered to help clean up, but spent most of the time trying to coax the iguana down from the top of my filing cabinet where it had retreated. By lunchtime, Rodrigo had made himself at home throughout the entire office. He'd investigated the break room, climbed onto the reception desk, and even wandered into one of our client meeting rooms during a video conference. The people on the call seemed confused about whether they were seeing things correctly. When our office manager returned the next day and learned about the iguana situation, she was completely floored. Jonas was told to take Rodrigo home immediately and received a formal written warning about bringing unauthorized animals to work without management approval. During the disciplinary conversation, Jonas argued that our employee handbook mentioned dogs and cats in the pet policy, but didn't specifically prohibit reptiles. He seemed to genuinely believe this technicality justified his decision to bring a 3-foot lizard to a professional workplace. The whole experience taught everyone that some workplace policies exist because common sense isn't as universal as we'd like to think. Jonas still occasionally mentions how unfair it was that Rodrigo got banned while dogs are welcome on certain days. That story is over. The mental image of a massive iguana casually knocking over coffee while climbing office furniture is both hilarious and horrifying. Jonas really thought he found a loophole in the pet policy by bringing a literal dinosaur to work. Some people have truly creative interpretations of what constitutes office-appropriate animals. Our next story comes from someone who learned about their relationship status in the most brutal way possible. My partner announced our breakup on social media before telling me. I'm 26 and I've been with Clara for about 2 years. We live together in a small apartment downtown, and while we've had our ups and downs like any couple, I thought we were working through things. Clara works at a marketing agency and spends a lot of time on social media for her job, so she's always posting stories and updates throughout the day. Last Tuesday started like any other day. I kissed Clara goodbye before heading to work, and she seemed normal, maybe a little quiet, but nothing that raised any red flags. We'd had a small argument the night before about whose turn it was to do the dishes, but it was hardly relationship-ending material. I was at my desk around 2 p.m. when my phone started buzzing non-stop. My co-worker Amy walked over and asked if I was okay because I looked pale. I checked my phone and saw dozens of notifications from Facebook, Instagram, and even text messages from friends and family. My heart sank when I saw what everyone was responding to. Clara had updated her Facebook status from in a relationship to single and posted a long caption about how she was finally free to focus on herself and excited for this new chapter. But that wasn't all. She'd also posted an Instagram story with a photo of herself, looking happy and relieved, with text overlay that read, "When you finally find the courage to leave what's not serving you anymore." The story had already been viewed by over 200 people, including my mum, my sister, and most of our mutual friends. I sat there staring at my phone in complete shock. We hadn't broken up. We hadn't even had a serious conversation about breaking up. I'd left for work that morning thinking I was in a relationship, and now I was apparently single, according to the entire internet. My phone kept buzzing with confused messages from friends asking what happened and if I was okay. I immediately tried calling Clara, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted her asking what was going on, but she didn't respond. I couldn't concentrate on work for the rest of the day, so I told my boss I had a family emergency and left early. When I got home, Clara's stuff was gone. Not all of it, but enough to make it clear she'd been planning this. Her clothes, toiletries, laptop, and the little succulent plants she'd been babying for months were all missing. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter that simply said, "I think we both know this wasn't working. I needed space to figure things out. I'll come back for the rest of my things this weekend." No explanation, no conversation, just a breakup announcement to the world and a post-it note for me. The worst part was dealing with everyone else's reactions. My mum called crying because she thought Clara was perfect for me. My sister was furious on my behalf. Friends were taking sides without even knowing what had happened, because nobody knew what had happened, including me. Clara's friends were liking her posts and commenting supportive messages about her brave decision, while I was left looking like either the villain or the clueless boyfriend who didn't see it coming. I tried reaching out to Clara over the next few days, not to get back together, but to understand what went wrong and why she chose to handle it this way. She finally responded with a text saying she didn't want to have a big dramatic conversation and that she thought it would be easier for both of us if she just ripped off the band-aid. Easier for who exactly? Because having your relationship status broadcast to hundreds of people before you even know you're single doesn't feel easy at all. Clara came by that weekend to get her remaining belongings while I was at my brother's place. She left her key on the counter and took the coffee maker we'd bought together. She also unfriended me on all social media platforms, which I only discovered when friends started asking if we'd blocked each other. By Monday, she was already posting photos from girls' nights out with captions about living her best life. The whole experience taught me that some people would rather face the judgment of strangers online than have an honest conversation with someone they supposedly cared about. It's been 3 weeks now, and I'm doing better, but I still can't believe someone I shared a bed with for 2 years thought a Facebook status update was an appropriate way to end our relationship. That story is over. The absolute cowardice of ending a 2-year relationship via social media post is staggering. Imagine finding out you're single from your mum's concerned phone call because she saw it on Facebook. Some people really will do anything to avoid a difficult conversation, even if it means humiliating someone they supposedly cared about. Speaking of workplace drama, our next story comes from someone dealing with a colleague who's mastered the art of deflecting responsibility. My co-worker puts my name on their work mistakes. I work at a mid-sized accounting firm where everyone knows everyone's business. I've been here for about 3 years, and for the most part, I get along well with my colleagues. The problem is Jonah, who sits in the cubicle next to mine. Jonah has been with the company for about 5 years, which gives him a bit of seniority over me, and he's never let me forget it. At first, I thought Jonah was just trying to be helpful. When I started, he'd offer to review my work or suggest improvements to my processes. I appreciated the guidance since I was still learning the ropes, but over time, I started noticing a disturbing pattern. Whenever something went wrong with a project or client account, Jonah would somehow manage to shift the focus onto me, even when the mistake was clearly his. The first major incident happened about 6 months ago. We were both working on a quarterly report for one of our biggest clients. Jonah was responsible for the financial projections section, while I handled the market analysis. The night before the deadline, Jonah realised he'd used outdated data for his projections, which threw off all the numbers. Instead of staying late to fix it himself, he sent me an email at 11 p.m. asking if I could double-check his work and make sure everything was accurate. I stayed until 2 a.m. fixing his mistakes, thinking I was being a good team player. But when our supervisor asked about the delayed submission the next morning, Jonah immediately said, "I had to wait for the market analysis section to be completed. There were some data accuracy issues that needed to be resolved." He technically wasn't lying, but he made it sound like I was the one who'd caused the delay. This became his signature move. Jonah would make an error, ask me to help fix it, then tell our boss that he'd handled the situation, but had to wait for corrections from my end. He had this way of framing every story that made him look like the responsible one, cleaning up other people's messes. Our supervisor started praising Jonah for his attention to detail and ability to catch problems before they reached clients. The breaking point came last month during our busiest season. Jonah had been working on a complex tax filing for a corporate client. He miscalculated some depreciation schedules, which could have resulted in significant penalties for the client if it had gone through. I caught the error during my routine review and pointed it out to him privately. Jonah thanked me and said he'd fix it right away. 2 days later, our supervisor called a team meeting to discuss the near miss with the corporate client. I expected Jonah to take responsibility for the mistake, or at least acknowledge that we'd caught it together. Instead, he stood up and gave this whole presentation about the importance of thorough review processes and how his diligent checking had prevented a major problem. He literally said, "I noticed some inconsistencies in the depreciation calculations and worked with the team to ensure accuracy." The team he was referring to was me, but he made it sound like he'd discovered the error himself and graciously involved others in the solution. Our supervisor was so impressed that she suggested Jonah lead a workshop on quality control for the entire department. I sat there in stunned silence as my colleague took credit for catching his own mistake, which I had actually found. After the meeting, I confronted Jonah privately. I told him I felt uncomfortable with how he'd presented the situation and asked him to be more accurate about what had actually happened. Jonah looked genuinely surprised and said he thought he'd been clear that it was a team effort. He claimed he never meant to take sole credit and that he appreciated my contributions, but his behaviour didn't change. Just last week, Jonah sent out an email to our entire team about a process improvement he'd implemented for client communications. The improvement was actually a suggestion I'd made during a team meeting 2 months ago, which Jonah had initially dismissed as unnecessary. When I reminded him that it was my idea, he said he'd built upon my initial concept and developed it into a comprehensive solution. I've started documenting everything now. I save emails, take notes during meetings, and make sure to copy our supervisor on important communications. It's exhausting having to constantly protect myself from someone who should be a teammate. The most frustrating part is that Jonah isn't incompetent. He's actually quite good at his job when he focuses. But he seems incapable of owning his mistakes or sharing credit for successes. Our annual reviews are coming up next month, and I'm dreading it. I know Jonah will find a way to highlight all the problems he's solved and processes he's improved, most of which will be situations where he cleaned up his own messes or implemented ideas that weren't originally his. Meanwhile, I'll look like someone who needs constant supervision and guidance, when the reality is that I'm often the one doing the supervising. That story ends there. The workplace credit thief is a special breed of colleague who somehow always manages to be the hero of their own narrative. Watching someone systematically rewrite history to make themselves look competent while undermining others is infuriating. The fact that supervisors often fall for this manipulation just makes it worse. Our next tale involves family dynamics and the kind of assumption that can destroy relationships. My brother tried to auction off my guitar at a yard sale. I'm 29, and I've been playing guitar since I was 14. Music has always been my escape, my therapy, and my creative outlet. About 5 years ago, I saved up for months to buy my dream guitar, a vintage acoustic that cost me nearly $3,000. It's not just an instrument to me, it's the guitar I wrote my first song on, the one I played when I proposed to my fiancée, and the one I hope to pass down to my kids someday. I live in an apartment across town from my childhood home, where my parents still live with my younger brother, Elias. Elias is 24 and still figuring out his life. He's lived at home since graduating college and works part-time at a local coffee shop while trying to start his own photography business. My parents have been incredibly patient with him, probably more patient than they were with me when I was his age. Last month I had to travel for work for about 3 weeks. My apartment doesn't have the best security, and I've had issues with break-ins in the neighbourhood before. I asked my parents if I could store some of my valuable items at their house while I was gone, including my guitar, my laptop, and some important documents. They said of course, and I moved everything to my old bedroom, which my parents have kept mostly intact since I moved out. When I got back from my trip, I was exhausted and decided to wait until the weekend to pick up my stuff. That Saturday morning, I drove over to my parents' house and was surprised to see cars parked all along the street and people walking around their front yard with boxes and bags. My mum had mentioned they were planning a yard sale, but I'd forgotten about it. I walked up to the house and started browsing the tables out of curiosity. My parents were selling old furniture, kitchen appliances, books, and the usual yard sale fare. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on a table next to some old board games and Christmas decorations, was my guitar. It had a price tag stuck to it that said $200. I rushed over and picked up the guitar, checking to make sure it wasn't damaged. A middle-aged man who'd been examining it looked annoyed and said, "Excuse me, I was looking at that." I told him it wasn't actually for sale and went to find Elias, who was manning the cash box near the garage. "Why is my guitar out there with a price tag on it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Elias looked up from counting money and shrugged. "Oh, that. Yeah, I figured you weren't using it anymore since it's been sitting in the bedroom for weeks. Mum said we could sell anything that's just taking up space." I stared at him in disbelief. "It's been there for 3 weeks because I was travelling for work. I specifically told Mum and Dad I was storing my valuable items here temporarily." Elias looked confused. Like this was the first time he was hearing this explanation. "Oh, I didn't know that. I just saw it collecting dust and thought it was fair game." The guitar had been sitting on its stand in the corner of my old bedroom, exactly where I'd left it. It wasn't hidden in a closet or buried under other items. Anyone who looked at it for more than 2 seconds could tell it was a high-quality instrument, not some garage sale cast-off. The case alone was worth more than the $200 price tag Elias had slapped on the guitar. I asked Elias if he'd sold anything else of mine, and he admitted he'd also put my old gaming console out for sale, even though it was clearly still being used since all my save files were still on it. Fortunately, no one had bought it yet. I gathered up my belongings and asked my parents what had happened. My mum was mortified when she realised what Elias had done. She said she'd told him he could price and sell items from the spare room and basement, but she'd assumed he understood that my things were off limits. My dad was furious with Elias for not asking before pricing my belongings, especially something as obviously valuable as the guitar. Elias tried to defend himself by saying he was just trying to help with the yard sale and that he didn't think I'd mind since I never play it anymore. This wasn't true at all. I play that guitar almost every day when I'm home, and Elias has heard me playing it during family gatherings and holidays. He also tried to argue that since I'd moved out, anything I left at the house was fair game for decluttering. The most frustrating part was that Elias didn't seem to understand why I was so upset. He kept saying it was an honest mistake and that he would have given me the $200 if someone had bought it. He genuinely seemed to think that the monetary value was the only thing that mattered, not the sentimental value or the fact that he'd tried to sell something that didn't belong to him without permission. We had a family meeting that afternoon where my parents made it clear that Elias needed to ask before making decisions about other people's property, even if it's stored in their house. Elias apologised, but it felt half-hearted, like he was sorry he got in trouble rather than sorry for what he'd done. The experience made me realise that I can't assume family members will respect my belongings just because we're related. I've since moved all my valuable items to a storage unit, which costs money I didn't want to spend, but at least I know my things are safe. The trust between Elias and me has been damaged, and I don't think he fully understands why. That story is over. The casual assumption that someone else's prized possession is just clutter shows a stunning lack of awareness. Trying to sell a $3,000 guitar for $200 because it's collecting dust is the kind of move that destroys family relationships. Some people really don't understand the difference between monetary and sentimental value. Our next story comes from someone who learned that some people will ruin special occasions just to make a statement. My partner invited their ex to our anniversary dinner. I'm 31 and I've been with Rosa for almost 3 years. Our relationship has had its challenges, but I thought we'd worked through most of them. Rosa has always maintained friendships with some of her exes, which I've tried to be understanding about, even though it sometimes makes me uncomfortable. She says it shows emotional maturity to stay on good terms with people you once cared about. Last week was our 3rd anniversary, and I'd been planning something special for weeks. I made reservations at this upscale Italian restaurant, where we had our first official date. It's not cheap, but anniversaries are important to me, and I wanted to celebrate how far we'd come as a couple. I even took the afternoon off work to pick up flowers and get ready properly. Rosa seemed excited about dinner when I brought it up earlier in the week. She talked about wearing the dress I'd bought her for her birthday and mentioned how nice it would be to have a romantic evening together. I was looking forward to reconnecting without the usual distractions of work and daily responsibilities. The day of our anniversary, I showed up at the restaurant right on time and asked the hostess for our table. She led me to a table for 4, which seemed wrong since I'd specifically requested a table for 2. I was about to mention the mistake when I saw Rosa walking toward me with someone I immediately recognised as her ex-boyfriend Marcus. Marcus is someone Rosa dated for about 2 years before we got together. They'd broken up because he moved across the country for a job, but they'd stayed in touch through social media and occasional phone calls. I'd met him once before at a party, and while he seemed decent enough, I'd never felt completely comfortable with their ongoing friendship. Rosa sat down and immediately launched into an explanation before I could ask what was happening. She said Marcus was in town for just one night on business, and since it was such short notice, she'd thought it would be nice to invite him to join us for dinner. She insisted it was just as friends, and that Marcus had always been curious about the restaurant, since she'd mentioned it to him before. I was stunned. This was supposed to be our anniversary dinner, a celebration of our relationship, and Rosa had turned it into a casual hangout with her ex. I asked her why she hadn't discussed this with me first, and she said she'd tried to call me earlier, but I hadn't answered. I checked my phone and saw one missed call from about an hour before dinner, but no voicemail or text explaining what she wanted to discuss. Marcus seemed to sense the tension and offered to leave, saying he didn't want to intrude on our special evening, but Rosa insisted he stay, saying we were all adults and it shouldn't be weird. She kept emphasizing how rarely she got to see Marcus and how it would be rude to uninvite him now that he was already there. The entire dinner was awkward beyond description. Rosa spent most of the time catching up with Marcus about his job, his new apartment, and mutual friends they both knew. She'd occasionally try to include me in the conversation, but I felt like a third wheel at my own anniversary dinner. Marcus was polite enough, but it was clear he and Rosa had a history and inside jokes that I wasn't part of. The worst moment came when Marcus mentioned a trip he and Rosa had taken to Europe when they were dating. Rosa got this nostalgic look in her eyes and started reminiscing about places they'd visited and experiences they'd shared. She was more animated talking about her past with Marcus than she'd been about our anniversary or our relationship in months. When the waiter asked if we were celebrating anything special, Rosa hesitated for a moment before mentioning it was our anniversary. Marcus looked surprised and apologized for intruding, but Rosa waved off his concerns and said anniversaries were just arbitrary dates anyway. That comment stung more than anything else that had happened that evening. I barely spoke during the rest of dinner. I felt like my feelings didn't matter, and that Rosa had prioritized her ex's convenience over our relationship milestone. When the check came, Marcus offered to pay his share, but Rosa insisted it was fine since we'd invited him. I ended up paying for a dinner I'd planned as a romantic celebration that had turned into an uncomfortable reunion. After Marcus left to catch his flight, Rosa asked why I'd been so quiet during dinner. I explained that I felt hurt and disrespected by her decision to invite her ex to our anniversary dinner without discussing it with me first. Rosa got defensive and said I was being possessive and immature. She argued that Marcus was just a friend and that my discomfort was my own issue to work through. Rosa said she'd expected me to be more understanding and that she was disappointed in my reaction. She claimed she'd thought I was secure enough in our relationship to handle having her ex around, and my jealousy showed I didn't trust her. She made it sound like my feelings were the problem, not her poor judgment in inviting her ex to our anniversary dinner. We haven't really resolved this issue. Rosa maintains that she did nothing wrong and that I'm overreacting. She says Marcus is an important friend to her and that I need to accept that she has a past. I understand that people can stay friends with exes, but I also think there are appropriate boundaries, especially during relationship milestones. The whole experience made me question whether Rosa truly understands what it means to prioritize our relationship. Anniversary dinners are supposed to be about celebrating your connection with your partner, not about accommodating ex-boyfriends who happen to be in town. I'm still trying to figure out if this is something we can work through, or if it reveals a fundamental incompatibility in how we view relationships. That story ends there. Turning your anniversary dinner into a reunion with your ex and then calling your partner jealous for being upset is relationship sabotage. 101. Some people really have no concept of appropriate boundaries or timing. The fact that she dismissed anniversaries as arbitrary dates while prioritizing her ex's visit says everything. Moving on to our next story about workplace power dynamics gone wrong. My boss refused to let me leave for a family emergency. I work as a junior analyst at a consulting firm downtown. The work environment is generally pretty intense, with long hours and high expectations, but I've always tried to be professional and reliable. My boss, Theo, has a reputation for being demanding, but I've managed to stay on his good side by consistently meeting deadlines and producing quality work. Last Thursday started like any other day. I was working on a quarterly report that was due the following week when my phone rang around 2 p.m. It was my sister calling to tell me that our dad had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains. She was crying and said the doctors weren't sure what was happening yet, but they were running tests and wanted family members there as soon as possible. I immediately felt sick to my stomach. My dad is 64 and has had some heart issues in the past, so chest pains were a serious concern. I grabbed my jacket and went straight to Theo's office to explain the situation and ask if I could leave for the rest of the day. I figured this was exactly the kind of emergency that any reasonable manager would understand. Theo barely looked up from his computer when I knocked on his door. I explained that my father was in the hospital and I needed to get there right away. Theo finally looked at me and asked how long I'd be gone. I said I wasn't sure, probably at least the rest of the day, possibly tomorrow depending on what the doctors found. That's when Theo's expression changed. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, the quarterly report is due next week, and we're already behind schedule. I really need you here to finish the analysis section." I stared at him, thinking he must have misunderstood the urgency of the situation. I repeated that my father was having a medical emergency and that I needed to be at the hospital with my family. Theo sighed and said, "Look, I sympathise with your situation, but the project comes first. Your family will understand if you show up a few hours later. The client won't understand if we miss our deadline." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was actually suggesting that a quarterly report was more important than my father's potential heart attack. I tried to explain that the report was already mostly finished and that I could easily complete the remaining work over the weekend or early next week. The deadline wasn't until Wednesday, so we had plenty of time. Theo shook his head and said that wasn't how things worked at our firm. He said commitment to the job meant being there when the team needed you, regardless of personal circumstances. The conversation got more heated when I pointed out that this wasn't a routine family dinner or vacation request. This was a genuine emergency involving my father's health. Theo actually rolled his eyes and said that everyone always claims their personal issues are emergencies. He said he'd heard it all before and that I needed to decide whether I was serious about my career or not. I was torn between wanting to tell him exactly what I thought of his attitude and needing to keep my job. I asked if there was any way I could work on the report remotely from the hospital, thinking this might be a reasonable compromise. Theo said the analysis required access to files that were only available in the office, and that remote work wasn't an option for this project. Finally, I made the decision that my family was more important than any job. I told Theo I was leaving regardless of his objections, and that I'd deal with the consequences later. His face turned red, and he said that walking out would be considered insubordination and could result in disciplinary action or termination. I left anyway. When I got to the hospital, I found my dad in the emergency room, hooked up to various monitors. The doctors had determined that he'd had a mild heart attack, but that he was stable. He needed to stay overnight for observation, but the prognosis was good. My mum and sister were relieved to see me, and my dad squeezed my hand and thanked me for coming so quickly. I spent the rest of the day and evening at the hospital, helping my mum navigate conversations with doctors and making sure my dad was comfortable. Around 10 p.m, I finally checked my work email and found 3 increasingly angry messages from Theo, demanding to know where I was and insisting that I come in early Friday morning to make up for lost time. Friday morning, I went to the office prepared for the worst. Theo called me into his office immediately and started lecturing me about responsibility and commitment. He said my behaviour the previous day was unacceptable and that he was formally writing me up for abandoning my duties. He made it clear that any future incidents would result in termination. I tried to explain that my father's condition had been serious and that family emergencies should take precedence over non-urgent work deadlines. Theo interrupted me and said that everyone has family issues, but that professional adults don't let personal problems interfere with their obligations. He said I needed to get my priorities straight if I wanted to succeed in the business world. The most infuriating part was that I'd finished the quarterly report by Monday morning, 2 full days before the deadline. The client was happy with the work, and the project was considered a success. Theo never acknowledged that his emergency hadn't actually been an emergency at all, or that I'd managed to complete everything on time, despite missing one afternoon. The incident has completely changed how I view my job and my boss. I used to respect Theo's high standards and work ethic, but now I see him as someone who lacks basic human compassion. I've started looking for other positions because I don't want to work for someone who thinks quarterly reports are more important than family medical emergencies. The whole experience taught me that some managers will always prioritise business over humanity, even in genuinely serious situations. I'm grateful that my dad is recovering well, but I'll never forget how Theo responded when I needed understanding and flexibility most. Some people really show their true character when you need them to act like human beings instead of corporate machines. That story is over. A boss who thinks a non-urgent quarterly report takes precedence over a parent's heart attack is operating with the emotional intelligence of a spreadsheet. The fact that everything got done on time anyway just proves how unnecessary that power trip really was. Some managers mistake cruelty for leadership and wonder why their teams don't respect them. Our next tale involves someone who discovered that casual cruelty often hides behind the excuse of humour. My friend made fun of my accent in front of everyone. I'm 24 and I moved to Chicago 3 years ago from rural Tennessee for graduate school. I've always been self-conscious about my accent, especially in academic settings where I felt like people made assumptions about my intelligence based on how I sounded. I'd worked hard to tone it down in professional situations, though it still comes through when I'm tired or emotional. My friend Leah and I met in our first semester of grad school and quickly bonded over our shared love of obscure documentaries and terrible reality TV. She's from California and has this polished way of speaking that I've always admired. We've spent countless hours studying together, and she's seen me through some of my most stressful moments in the program. I thought she understood how sensitive I was about my background and the way people sometimes perceived me. Last Friday, a group of us from our program went out to celebrate finishing our thesis proposals. It was a big deal because we'd all been working on these projects for months, and getting through that milestone felt like a huge weight off our shoulders. We were at this trendy bar downtown, the kind of place where craft cocktails cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a week back home. I was telling everyone about my research on rural healthcare access, something I'm genuinely passionate about since it affects communities like the one I grew up in. I was explaining how limited resources impact patient outcomes when I got excited and my accent started coming through stronger than usual. I noticed it happening but figured it didn't matter since these were my friends and we were celebrating. That's when Leah interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "Oh my God, you sound like such a hillbilly right now." She started mimicking my pronunciation of certain words, exaggerating the drawl to make it sound even more stereotypical. The entire table went quiet, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Leah didn't stop there. She kept going with the impression, saying things like, "Well, I reckon that's mighty interesting, and you'll come back now you hear," in this cartoonish voice that sounded nothing like how I actually speak. A few people at the table laughed nervously, probably not knowing how to react to the situation. I tried to laugh it off and change the subject, but Leah seemed energized by the attention she was getting. She started telling stories about funny things I'd said in the past, imitating my accent each time. She brought up a conversation we'd had weeks earlier about my hometown, where I'd mentioned something about fixing to go to the store, and she acted like it was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. The worst part was that she was doing this in front of people from our program, including professors and other students I'd worked hard to earn respect from. I watched as their expressions changed, and I could see them looking at me differently. All the effort I'd put into being taken seriously as a scholar felt like it was unravelling in real time. When I finally told Leah that she was making me uncomfortable and asked her to stop, she rolled her eyes and said, "Come on, it's just a joke, you're being way too sensitive." She said I should be proud of where I came from and that there was nothing wrong with sounding authentic. But her tone made it clear she didn't really believe that. I left the bar soon after, claiming I had a headache. The next day, Leah texted me, acting like nothing had happened. She sent me a meme about our thesis defense coming up and asked if I wanted to study together that afternoon. When I brought up what had happened the night before, she said she didn't understand why I was so upset about harmless teasing. Leah insisted that she was just having fun and that everyone makes jokes about regional accents. She said her friends from New York make fun of her California surfer girl voice all the time, and she doesn't take it personally. She couldn't seem to understand that making fun of a southern accent carries different implications and reinforces stereotypes about intelligence and education. The incident has made me question our entire friendship. I realise now that Leah has made little comments about my background before, things I brushed off at the time, but that were probably more revealing than I wanted to admit. She's made jokes about me going back to the holler after graduation and asked if I knew how to use technology before coming to the city. What hurts most is that I'd confided in Leah about my insecurities and the challenges of adapting to academic culture. She knew exactly how sensitive I was about this topic, and she chose to use it as material for entertainment at my expense. That kind of betrayal from someone I considered a close friend is harder to deal with than comments from strangers. I've started avoiding study sessions with Leah and have been more careful about who I trust with personal information. The experience taught me that some people will exploit your vulnerabilities for a quick laugh, even when they know it causes genuine pain. I'm still working on my thesis about healthcare in rural communities, but now I'm also thinking about the broader ways that classism and regional prejudice affect people's opportunities and how they're perceived in professional settings. That story's over. Using someone's background as comedic material, especially when you know they're sensitive about it, isn't friendship. It's performative cruelty disguised as humour. Real friends protect your insecurities instead of weaponizing them for entertainment. Our next story comes from someone who learned that boundaries don't exist for certain people, even when it comes to personal belongings. My partner gave away my favourite hoodie without asking. I'm 28, and I have this navy blue hoodie that I've owned for about 6 years. It's nothing fancy, just a basic pullover from a brand that doesn't even exist anymore. But it's hands down the most comfortable piece of clothing I've ever owned. The fabric has gotten softer over time, and it fits perfectly after years of wear. I know it sounds silly to be attached to a piece of clothing, but that hoodie has been with me through college finals, breakups, job interviews, and countless lazy weekends. My partner Selene and I have been living together for about 8 months. She's always been generous with her things and has this philosophy about sharing everything in a relationship. She'll wear my t-shirts to bed and lets me borrow her books or use her skincare products. I appreciate the openness, but I've always been more private about my belongings. There are certain things that feel personal to me, and the hoodie is definitely one of them. Selena has commented on the hoodie before, usually to tease me about how often I wear it. She calls it my security blanket and jokes that I'm more attached to it than I am to her. I laugh along because I know she's not being mean, but there's some truth to what she says. That hoodie is my go-to comfort item when I'm stressed or just want to feel cozy at home. Last weekend, Selena's friend Mia came over to hang out. Mia had just gone through a bad breakup and was staying on our couch for a few days while she figured out her living situation. I felt bad for her and wanted to be supportive, so I didn't mind the temporary houseguest situation. Mia seemed nice enough, though she had this habit of borrowing things without asking first. On Saturday morning, I was looking for my hoodie so I could wear it while working on some freelance projects from home. I checked the laundry basket, the closet, and all the usual places where I might have left it, but it was nowhere to be found. I asked Selene if she'd seen it, and she got this weird look on her face. "Oh, about that," Selena said. "Mia was really cold last night and didn't have any warm clothes with her. I let her borrow it to sleep in." I was a little annoyed that Selena hadn't asked me first, but I figured it was just for one night. I told her that was fine, but asked her to make sure I got it back because I wanted to wear it that day. Selena hesitated before responding. Actually, she really loved how it looked on her. It fits her better than it fits you, and she said the colour brings out her eyes. I told her she could keep it. I stared at Selene in disbelief. She had given away my favourite piece of clothing to someone I barely knew without asking me, and was acting like this was a reasonable decision. I tried to explain why the hoodie was important to me, and that I wasn't comfortable with her giving it away. Selena seemed surprised by my reaction, and said she didn't realise I was so possessive about clothes. She pointed out that I have plenty of other hoodies and that Mia needed it more since she was going through a tough time and didn't have much with her. When I asked where Mia was so I could talk to her about getting the hoodie back, Selena said she'd already left for work wearing it. She said it would be awkward and selfish to ask for it back now, especially since Mia was dealing with so much stress. Selena made it sound like I was being petty for caring about just a hoodie when her friend was struggling. I spent the rest of the day feeling frustrated and violated. It wasn't really about the hoodie itself, though I genuinely loved that piece of clothing. It was about the fact that Selena had made a decision about my property without involving me at all. She'd decided that her friend's needs were more important than my attachment to something that belonged to me. When Mia came back that evening, she was indeed wearing my hoodie. It did look good on her, I had to admit, but that didn't make the situation any less uncomfortable. I considered asking for it back directly, but Selene had framed it in a way that made me feel like I'd be the bad guy for taking clothes away from someone who was already down on their luck. Over the next few days, I watched Mia wear my hoodie around the apartment like it had always been hers. She'd curl up on the couch in it while watching TV, or wear it when she went out to run errands. Every time I saw it, I felt a little pang of loss, which made me feel ridiculous, but was real nonetheless. When I brought the issue up with Selene again, she accused me of being materialistic and said she was disappointed in my lack of empathy for Mia's situation. She said that in a healthy relationship, partners should be willing to share everything, and that my attachment to objects showed I wasn't fully committed to our partnership. Selena also pointed out that the hoodie looked better on Mia anyway because she was smaller, and the oversized fit looked more intentional on her. She said I should be happy that something I wasn't using to its full potential was now being appreciated by someone who really needed it. The suggestion that I wasn't using my own hoodie to its full potential was particularly infuriating. Mia moved out a few days later, taking the hoodie with her. She thanked us both for our hospitality and mentioned how much she loved her new favourite hoodie. Selena beamed like she'd performed some great act of charity. I never got my hoodie back, and bringing it up now would just seem petty since so much time has passed. The whole experience taught me that Selena and I have fundamentally different views about personal property and boundaries within relationships. She sees sharing as a sign of love and trust, while I see asking permission as a sign of respect. I'm still not sure if we can reconcile these different approaches, but I've definitely become more protective of the things that matter to me. That story is over. Giving away someone's beloved possession without permission isn't generosity. It's theft with good intentions. The fact that she made him feel selfish for wanting his own hoodie back is emotional manipulation at its finest. Some people mistake boundary violations for relationship intimacy. Speaking of family members who overstep boundaries, our next story involves someone whose special day got hijacked by attention-seeking behaviour. My cousin photobombed every single wedding picture. I got married last month after 2 years of planning what I hoped would be the perfect day. My fiancé and I had saved up for over a year to afford the venue, photographer, and all the details that go into a wedding. We're not wealthy people, so every dollar spent was carefully considered. The photographer alone cost us $2,500, which felt like a huge investment, but we knew we'd treasure those photos forever. My cousin Mira was invited to the wedding along with most of my extended family. Mira is 23 and has always been the type of person who needs to be the centre of attention in any situation. At family gatherings, she's constantly performing, telling loud stories, or finding ways to redirect conversations back to herself. I've learned to expect this behaviour from her, but I figured she'd tone it down for my wedding day. The ceremony itself went beautifully. Mira sat with the rest of the family and seemed to behave appropriately during the vows and ring exchange. I was relieved that she was respecting the solemnity of the moment and letting me have my spotlight for once. The problem started during the reception, when we began taking formal photos. Our photographer had a detailed shot list that we'd worked on together for weeks. We wanted photos with immediate family, extended family groups, college friends, work colleagues, and all the various combinations that would capture everyone important to us. The photographer was efficient and professional, moving us through different poses and groupings to make sure we got all the shots we wanted. During the first few family photos, I noticed Mira positioning herself strategically in the background, but I didn't think much of it at first. She wasn't in the shots she wasn't supposed to be in, so I figured she was just trying to stay out of the way. It wasn't until we got our photos back 2 weeks later that I realised what had actually been happening. In every single photo where Mira was visible in the background, she had made some kind of silly face or gesture. In our formal family portrait, she's making bunny ears behind her father's head. In the photo with my college roommates, she's sticking her tongue out. In the romantic shot of me and my new husband during our first dance, you can see Mira in the background, making exaggerated kissing faces at the camera. She had systematically photobombed our entire wedding album. Not just a few shots here and there, but literally every photo where she appeared, even partially, in the frame. It was like she had made it her mission to insert herself into our wedding memories in the most disruptive way possible. The worst ones were the photos that were supposed to be intimate moments between me and my husband. During our cake cutting, Mira managed to get herself into the background of the shot, making a shocked expression with her hands on her cheeks, like she was witnessing something scandalous. In what should have been a sweet photo of me dancing with my father, Mira is visible behind us doing some kind of exaggerated dance move that draws attention away from the moment. When I called Mira to ask her about the photos, she burst out laughing and said she thought it was hilarious. She said she'd been trying to add some personality to what she considered boring formal photos. She seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't amused by her antics and kept saying things like, "Come on, you have to admit it's funny, and you're taking this way too seriously."
Right.
Mira insisted that she'd made the photos more interesting and memorable than they would have been otherwise. She said formal wedding photos are always stiff and awkward, and her photobombing had added spontaneity and humour to the album. She couldn't understand why I was upset about what she saw as harmless fun. When I explained that we'd paid a lot of money for those photos and that they were supposed to document one of the most important days of our lives, Mira said I was being too uptight. She pointed out that we had plenty of photos without her in them, and that the ones she'd enhanced would make us laugh when we looked at them years later. The photographer felt terrible when I showed him the photos and offered to do some editing to minimise Mira's presence in the background shots. He was able to crop some of the photos differently, and even Photoshop Mira out of a few of them, but the damage was already done to many of our formal portraits. My husband was furious when he saw the photos. He said Mira had deliberately sabotaged our wedding memories and that her behaviour was selfish and immature. He wanted to confront her directly, but I convinced him to let me handle it, since she's my family member. When I told other family members what had happened, reactions were mixed. Some people thought it was just typical Mira behaviour and that I should laugh it off. Others were horrified and said she'd crossed a line by disrupting such an important event. My parents were embarrassed and offered to help pay for a second photo session, but it wouldn't be the same since we can't recreate the actual wedding day. The experience taught me that some people will prioritise their own entertainment over other people's special moments, even when those moments can never be repeated. Mira turned our wedding photos into a documentation of her attention-seeking behaviour rather than our commitment to each other. Every time I look at our album now, I see her antics instead of focusing on the joy and love we were celebrating that day. That story is over. Imagine spending $20,500 on wedding photos only to discover your cousin turned your album into her personal comedy show. Wedding photobombing isn't quirky humour. It's narcissistic vandalism of irreplaceable memories. Some people genuinely can't let others have a moment without making it about themselves. Moving on to workplace etiquette violations, our next story involves someone whose lunch choices became everyone else's problem. My co-worker brings fish for lunch every day and microwaves it. I work in an open concept office with about 30 people spread across different departments. We have one small break room with 2 microwaves, a refrigerator, and a few tables where people eat lunch. The ventilation in our building isn't great, so smells tend to linger and spread throughout the workspace pretty quickly. About 3 months ago, a new guy named Owen joined our accounting team. He sits about 2 desks away from me, and he seemed nice enough during his first week. Owen is really into fitness and healthy eating, which I can respect. He brings his lunch from home every day and talks a lot about meal prep and nutrition. At first, I thought it was cool that he was so dedicated to his health goals. The problem started in Owen's second week, when he began bringing fish for lunch every single day. Not just any fish, but really pungent varieties like mackerel, sardines, and salmon. He'd heat them up in the microwave for what felt like an eternity, filling the entire office with the smell of hot fish. The odour would hit you like a wall when you walked into the break room, and it would spread throughout the office within minutes. At first, people tried to be polite about it. A few co-workers made gentle comments about the strong smell, hoping Owen would take the hint. Someone even jokingly suggested that maybe he could eat cold lunches sometimes for variety. Owen would laugh and say something about how fish was brain food, and that he needed his omega-3s to stay sharp for all those spreadsheets. The smell became a daily assault on everyone's senses. You'd be sitting at your desk, focused on your work, when suddenly the overwhelming odour of heated fish would waft across the office. People started timing their lunch breaks to avoid the break room when Owen was in there. Some colleagues began eating at their desks or going out for lunch more often, even though that was more expensive. What made it worse was that Owen would microwave his fish for much longer than necessary. Most people heat their lunch for a minute or two, but Owen would set the timer for 4 or 5 minutes, ensuring maximum odour penetration. He'd also leave the microwave door closed after heating, trapping the smell inside until the next person opened it and got hit with a concentrated fish cloud. The situation reached a breaking point when clients started commenting on the smell during meetings. We had an important presentation with potential new clients, and one of them actually asked if there was a seafood restaurant in our building. Our boss looked mortified and had to make up some excuse about the building's ventilation system having issues. After that incident, our manager sent out a general email about being considerate with food choices in the office. The message mentioned avoiding strongly scented foods and being mindful of shared spaces. It was clearly directed at Owen, but he either didn't get the message or chose to ignore it. He continued bringing fish every single day. When I finally decided to talk to Owen directly, I tried to be diplomatic about it. I mentioned that the fish smell was pretty strong and asked if he'd ever considered varying his lunch routine. Owen got defensive immediately and started lecturing me about the health benefits of eating fish daily. He said he'd done extensive research on nutrition and that fish was essential for brain function and heart health. Owen also pointed out that the office policy didn't specifically prohibit fish, just strongly scented foods, which he argued was subjective. He said that what smells strong to one person might be perfectly normal to another. He claimed that people were being too sensitive and that he shouldn't have to change his healthy eating habits because others were picky about smells. The conversation took an awkward turn when Owen suggested that maybe other people should start eating healthier foods too. He said if more people brought nutritious lunches like fish, everyone would get used to the smell and it wouldn't be an issue. He seemed to genuinely believe that the problem was other people's diets, not his daily fish heating routine. Things got even worse when Owen started bringing different types of fish that somehow smelled even stronger than his usual rotation. He brought whole mackerel one day, then some kind of fermented fish sauce another day. It was like he was testing the limits of what he could get away with. The break room became completely unusable during lunch hours. Several people complained to management, and eventually our boss had to have a direct conversation with Owen about his lunch choices. Owen was told that while the company supported healthy eating, he needed to find alternatives that were more considerate of the shared workspace. The boss suggested cold fish salads or eating his hot fish lunches off-site. Owen grudgingly agreed to change his routine, but he was clearly resentful about it. He started making passive-aggressive comments about how the office was discriminatory against people with healthy lifestyles. He'd eat sad-looking cold lunches while making pointed remarks about how much better his meals used to be when he could heat them properly. The whole situation taught me that some people will prioritize their personal preferences over common courtesy, even when it affects dozens of co-workers daily. Owen never seemed to understand that being right about fish being healthy didn't make him right about subjecting everyone else to the smell. Sometimes being considerate matters more than being technically correct about office policies. That story is over. Turning your workplace into a seafood market every single day isn't dedication to health. It's inconsiderate behaviour disguised as wellness. The fact that he doubled down when confronted shows he cared more about his omega-3s than his colleagues' basic comfort. Our next story shows how some people will sacrifice quality time for virtual entertainment, even when it hurts the people they supposedly care about. My partner cancelled our date to play video games with friends. I've been with Juliet for about 6 months, and overall our relationship has been really good. She's funny, smart, and we usually have great communication about our needs and expectations. The one area where we sometimes clash is around time management and priorities. Juliet is a big gamer and spends several hours most evenings playing online with her friend group from college. I don't mind gaming as a hobby at all. I play occasionally myself, and I understand the appeal of having a regular group to play with. What bothers me is when gaming takes precedence over plans we've already made together. This has happened a few times where Juliet will get distracted by a game session that runs longer than expected, causing us to be late for dinner reservations or movie times. Last Friday, we had planned what I thought was going to be a special evening together. I'd made reservations at this new restaurant that had been getting great reviews, and we talked about trying it for weeks. The reservation was for 7 p.m, and I'd taken the afternoon off work to make sure I had time to get ready and pick Juliet up without feeling rushed. Around 4 p.m, I texted Juliet to confirm what time I should come by to pick her up. She responded that she'd just started a ranked match with her gaming group and that the session might run a little long. She asked if we could push our reservation back by an hour or so. I was annoyed but figured I could probably call the restaurant and see if they had availability later. When I called the restaurant, they said they could move us to a 9 p.m. slot, but that was the latest they could accommodate us since they stopped seating new tables at 9:30. I texted Juliet the updated time, and she said that would work perfectly. I spent the extra time at home getting ready and looking forward to our evening out. At 6:30, Juliet texted me that her team was on a winning streak and they were trying to climb to the next rank bracket. She said the games were going really well and asked if we could postpone dinner until tomorrow night instead. She promised we'd do something even nicer to make up for the short notice change. I was frustrated but tried to be understanding. I know how gaming ranks work and that sometimes you get on a roll and want to keep going while you're playing well. I told Juliet that was fine and asked what she wanted to do tomorrow instead. She said she'd think of something special and that she really appreciated me being flexible. Saturday evening came around and I was expecting Juliet to follow through on her promise to plan something nice for us. When I asked her about our plans, she seemed confused and said she'd forgotten that she'd already made plans to go to her sister's birthday party. She said she'd mentioned it to me before, but I had no memory of this conversation. Juliet suggested we hang out Sunday instead, but when Sunday came, she said she needed to do laundry and meal prep for the week. She promised we'd definitely do something during the upcoming week, but she never followed through on making actual plans. Every time I brought it up, she'd say she was busy or stressed or that we'd figure something out soon. This pattern has continued for the past month. Juliet will make plans with me, then cancel or postpone them when something more immediately appealing comes up, usually related to gaming with her friends. She always promises we'll reschedule and do something even better, but those make-up plans rarely materialize. What's particularly frustrating is that Juliet's gaming sessions aren't even scheduled events. It's not like she's part of a competitive team with set practice times or tournament obligations. These are casual sessions with friends where they decide to play on the spur of the moment and then lose track of time. She treats these impromptu gaming marathons as more important than plans we've made in advance. Last week, I tried to have a conversation with Juliet about how her gaming habits were affecting our relationship. I explained that I felt like I was always being deprioritized in favor of whatever gaming opportunity came up. I told her it hurt when she'd cancel our plans last minute and then never follow through on rescheduling. Juliet got defensive and said I was being controlling and trying to interfere with her friendships. She pointed out that her gaming group only gets together a few times a week and that these sessions are important for maintaining those relationships. She said I should be more supportive of her hobbies instead of making her feel guilty about them. She also argued that our relationship shouldn't require such rigid scheduling and that couples should be flexible with each other. Juliet said that if I really cared about her, I'd understand that sometimes gaming sessions run long and that plans need to change. She made it sound like my desire for reliable date nights was unreasonable and clingy. The conversation ended with Juliet promising she'd be more mindful about balancing gaming time with couple time. She said she hadn't realised how often she was cancelling our plans and that she'd make a better effort going forward. She suggested we could even game together sometimes, so I wouldn't feel left out of that part of her life. For about a week, things seemed to improve. Juliet stuck to the plans we made and even introduced me to her gaming friends during one of their sessions. I started to think we'd worked through the issue and found a good balance. But then last Thursday, the same pattern emerged again. We'd planned to cook dinner together and watch a movie at her place. I brought groceries and wine, looking forward to a cozy evening in. When I arrived, Juliet was already deep into a game session with her friends. She said they'd just started and that she'd be done in about 30 minutes. I waited for 2 hours while she played, occasionally calling out apologies from her gaming setup. By the time Juliet finally finished playing, it was almost 10 p.m, and I'd lost interest in cooking or watching a movie. I felt like I'd spent my evening sitting alone in her living room while she had fun with other people. When I expressed my frustration, Juliet said she'd lost track of time and that her friends had really needed her help with a difficult quest. The most hurtful part is that Juliet seems genuinely confused about why I'm upset. She keeps saying that gaming is just her way of relaxing and socializing, and that I should understand that sometimes these sessions are more important than whatever we had planned. She doesn't seem to grasp that consistently, cancelling plans sends a message about priorities. I've started to wonder if Juliet and I are just incompatible when it comes to how we value time together. She sees our relationship as something that should be flexible and accommodating to whatever else is happening in her life. I see it as something that deserves intentional time and attention, not just whatever's left over after gaming sessions. The situation has made me realise that some people will always prioritise immediate gratification over commitments they've made to others. Juliet gets more satisfaction from gaming achievements than from keeping promises to me, and no amount of conversation seems to change that fundamental difference in how we approach relationships. That story is over. Consistently choosing virtual achievements over real-world relationships shows where someone's true priorities lie. Promising to reschedule and never following through isn't flexibility. It's just broken promises with extra steps. Some people mistake relationship patience for relationship permission to always put their partner last. Our next tale involves family members who think personal boundaries don't apply when it comes to comedy content. My sister posted my childhood journal online as a joke. I'm 25, and my younger sister Hugo is 21. We've always had a complicated relationship, mostly because she's never understood the concept of personal boundaries. Growing up, she'd go through my room when I wasn't home, borrow my clothes without asking, and generally treat my personal space like it was community property. I thought she'd outgrown this behaviour as we got older, but apparently I was wrong. Hugo has been trying to build a social media following for the past year or so. She posts on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, mostly doing comedy skits and relatable content about growing up with siblings. Some of her videos have gotten decent engagement, and she's convinced she's on the verge of becoming internet famous. She's constantly looking for new material and angles that will help her videos go viral. Last month, I moved back home temporarily while I transitioned between apartments. It was supposed to be just for a few weeks, but finding a place in my price range has taken longer than expected. Being back in my childhood room has been nostalgic, and I've been going through some old boxes of stuff my parents had stored in the closet. Among the boxes, I found my old journals from middle school and high school. I used to write in them almost every day, documenting typical teenage drama, crushes, friend conflicts, and all the emotional intensity that comes with adolescence. Reading through them was embarrassing, but also sweet in a way. I could remember exactly how important everything felt at the time, even the stuff that seems silly now. The journals contained some pretty personal stuff, including details about my first relationship, fights with friends, insecurities about my appearance, and family issues that were happening during those years. There were entries about feeling depressed during my sophomore year of high school, concerns about college applications, and typical teenage angst that I'd never want anyone else to read. I left the journals on my desk while I continued going through other boxes, not thinking anyone would be interested in dusty old notebooks. Hugo had seen me looking through them and asked what they were, but I just said they were old school stuff and didn't think much of her curiosity. A few days later, I was at work when my phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends were tagging me in comments on Hugo's latest TikTok video, which had already gotten thousands of views. My stomach dropped when I opened the app and saw what she'd posted. Hugo had made a video called Reading My Sister's Cringy Middle School Diary, where she sat in her room, dramatically reading excerpts from my journals. She was using different voices and exaggerated expressions to make my teenage writing sound as ridiculous as possible. The video showed her flipping through pages of my actual handwriting while she performed my most embarrassing thoughts for her audience. She'd chosen some of the most mortifying entries to read aloud. There was the entry about my crush on my math teacher, complete with my analysis of why I thought he looked at me differently than other students. She read the part where I'd written about getting my first period and how scared I was to tell my mum. She even included entries about fights I'd had with Hugo herself, where I'd written about feeling like she never respected my privacy. The video had hundreds of comments, from people laughing at my teenage thoughts and experiences. Strangers were making jokes about my middle school romantic fantasies and commenting on how weird and dramatic I was as a teenager. Some people were even sharing their own similar experiences, but that didn't make me feel any better about having mine broadcast without permission. When I got home that evening, I confronted Hugo immediately. She was sitting at her computer, editing another video, probably planning to milk this content for multiple posts. I asked her how she could possibly think it was okay to share my personal writings without asking me first. Hugo seemed genuinely surprised by my anger. She said she thought it was hilarious and that everyone had embarrassing teenage journals they'd be mortified about. She pointed out that she hadn't used my real name in the video and that she'd only read the funny parts, not anything too serious or personal. She acted like she'd done me a favour by editing out the darker entries. When I told her she needed to take the video down immediately, Hugo said I was overreacting and being too sensitive. She argued that the video was already getting great engagement and that taking it down now would hurt her algorithm performance. She said most people found it relatable and funny, not mean-spirited. Hugo also pointed out that she was my sister and that family members should be able to joke about each other without everything becoming a big dramatic situation. She said I should be supporting her content creation efforts instead of trying to sabotage them over something harmless like old journal entries. The most infuriating part of her response was when she said that if I was really upset about it, she could blur out my handwriting in future videos, but that she wasn't going to delete content that was performing well. She offered to split any money she made from sponsorships on videos featuring my journals, like that would somehow make the violation acceptable. I tried to explain that those journals contain my private thoughts from a time when I was vulnerable and figuring out who I was. Reading someone's diary without permission is a massive breach of trust, and sharing it with thousands of strangers online makes it exponentially worse. Hugo kept insisting it was just content and that I was taking it too personally. When I threatened to tell our parents what she'd done, Hugo finally agreed to take the video down, but not before making me feel like I was ruining her chances at social media success. She acted like I was the villain for not wanting my teenage diary entries used as comedy material for her TikTok audience. The video was only up for about 48 hours, but it felt like a lifetime, knowing that strangers had been laughing at my most private teenage thoughts. Even though it's gone now, I keep worrying that someone screen recorded it, or that copies of it are floating around somewhere online. The internet has a way of making nothing truly disappear. The whole experience has damaged my relationship with Hugo significantly. I don't trust her around my personal belongings anymore, and I've moved all my important stuff out of the house, even though I'm still staying there temporarily. She continues to act like I overreacted to a harmless sibling prank, but violating someone's privacy for content isn't pranking, it's exploitation. That story's over. Using someone's most vulnerable teenage thoughts as comedy material for social media isn't sibling teasing, it's emotional exploitation for views. The fact that she offered to share sponsorship money like that would make it acceptable shows how completely she missed the point. Some people will commodify any relationship for content, including their own family members. Moving on to workplace abuse of power, our next story involves a manager who confused tyranny with leadership. My manager tried to force everyone to work on Christmas Day. I work at a mid-sized insurance company where most of our business is conducted during regular weekday hours. We handle policy renewals, claims processing, and customer service calls, but none of our services are emergency related or require 24/7 staffing. The company has always been pretty reasonable about holidays, typically closing on major holidays like Christmas, New Year's Day, and Thanksgiving. Our department manager Ethan started about 6 months ago after the previous manager retired. Ethan came from a corporate consulting background and immediately started making changes to what he called inefficient practices and outdated policies. He implemented new productivity tracking systems, revised our break schedules, and generally tried to squeeze more output from the same number of employees. Most of us adapted to Ethan's management style, even though it was more intense than what we were used to. He emphasized metrics, deadlines, and what he called professional dedication. Ethan frequently made comments about how successful companies require employees who go above and beyond normal expectations. 2 weeks before Christmas, Ethan called a department meeting to discuss holiday coverage. I assumed he was going to review our normal holiday schedule and maybe ask for volunteers to handle any emergency situations that might come up. Instead, he announced that our department would be operating with full staff on Christmas Day. Ethan explained that he'd been analysing our productivity numbers and noticed that we always had a backlog to catch up on after holiday breaks. He said that working through Christmas would allow us to start the new year ahead of schedule rather than behind. He presented this as an opportunity for our department to show leadership and commitment to the company's success. The room went completely silent. Most of us have families and had already made Christmas plans. Some people had bought plane tickets to visit relatives in other states. Others were hosting family gatherings that had been planned for months. Everyone looked stunned by the idea that we'd be expected to abandon our holiday plans to process insurance paperwork. When someone asked if working Christmas Day would be voluntary overtime, Ethan shook his head and said this would be a regular workday with regular pay. He said that truly dedicated employees shouldn't expect extra compensation for doing what's best for the company. He framed it as a test of our commitment and team spirit. Several people tried to explain that they had non-refundable travel plans or family obligations that couldn't be rescheduled. Ethan listened to these concerns with visible impatience and then said that corporate success required personal sacrifice and that employees who weren't willing to make that sacrifice didn't belong at the company. The meeting ended with Ethan telling us that he expected everyone to confirm their availability for Christmas Day by the end of the week. He said he understood that some people might have personal commitments, but that he hoped we'd all make the right choice for our careers and the team. Over the next few days, people were quietly discussing the situation in small groups. Everyone was frustrated and looking for ways to push back against Ethan's unreasonable demand. Some people started researching company policy and labour laws to see if he could actually force us to work on Christmas. On Thursday, one of my co-workers brought up the Christmas Day requirement during a company-wide meeting with upper management. She asked if this was a new company policy or if it was specific to our department. The VP of Operations looked confused and said he wasn't aware of any plans to have departments working on Christmas Day. It turned out that Ethan had made this decision entirely on his own, without consulting with anyone above him in the company hierarchy. When the executives learned what he'd done, they were not pleased. Ethan had to send out an email the next day, retracting his Christmas Day requirement and apologising for any confusion. The whole experience showed me that some managers will abuse whatever small amount of power they have, even when it means destroying employee morale and violating basic human decency. Ethan genuinely seemed to believe that demanding people abandon their families on Christmas would somehow prove their dedication to processing insurance claims. The fact that he hadn't even bothered to get approval from his own superiors made it clear he was just on a power trip. That story's over. Imagine being so drunk on authority that you think you can cancel Christmas for your entire department without even checking with your boss first. The fact that he framed abandoning your family on Christmas as a career test shows how completely detached from reality some managers can become. And there we have it, another night of diving deep into the chaos that people willingly share with the internet. If these tales helped you feel less alone during whatever endless night you're having, then we've done what you came here to do. Sleep well, and remember that tomorrow's drama is not your drama.